a rusted car, $8 million, and a man the whole world laughed at. The auction hall went completely silent when the gavel came down. $8 million. Not for the gleaming Bugatti in the front row, not for the scarlet Ferrari that billionaires had been circling all morning like sharks, but for a dusty green car, corroded, forgotten, dismissed as scrap metal by an entire room full of experts just days earlier. The man who won wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't a famous collector or a hedge fund manager in a tailored suit. He was a 32-year-old mechanic with grease still embedded under his fingernails and a 10-year-old girl sitting quietly beside him, wearing a dress she'd ironed herself that morning because she wanted to look nice for her dad. This is the story of how Cole Bennett found what everyone else walked past, and why it changed everything. If this story means something to you, drop a like, leave a comment, tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this goes. The morning Cole Bennett bought the car nobody wanted, he almost didn't go to the auction at all. He'd gotten up at 5:15, same as every weekday, made 2 lunches, one for himself, one for Maya, packed her backpack while she was still half asleep, and driven her to school 40 minutes before the bell, because Mrs. Hargrove did early reading and Maya loved it more than she'd ever admit out loud. After drop-off, he'd sat in the parking lot of the school for a few minutes with the engine idling, drinking gas station coffee that tasted like burnt plastic, scrolling through the auction catalog on his phone with one thumb. He wasn't planning to buy anything. He was planning to look. That was the thing about Cole. He was always looking. Even when he had no money to spend, no reason to be somewhere, no business walking into rooms full of people who wore watches that cost more than his truck. He looked anyway. His father had taught him that. The education's free, Cole. They charge you for the stupidity of not paying attention. The Hargrove Classic Motor Auction was held every 2 years at the Meridian Convention Center in downtown Claremont, and it was exactly the kind of event Cole had no business attending. Valet parking, a registration fee just to get a bidder's paddle, men in blazers carrying programs that were printed on paper thicker than anything Cole owned. He'd been twice before, both times as a spectator, both times wearing his cleanest flannel and feeling like he'd wandered into someone else's life by accident. This time he wore his good jacket, the dark navy one that Maya had gotten him for his birthday. She'd saved up for 3 months without telling him, nickels and dimes from her allowance, and presented it to him in a grocery bag with her name written on a post-it because she couldn't find wrapping paper. He'd worn it maybe 4 times since. He put it on that morning and caught his reflection in the hallway mirror and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not confidence, not hope. Something quieter than both. He got to the convention center at 9:40. The auction didn't start until 11, but the viewing floor opened early, and Cole had learned years ago that the viewing floor was where the real information lived. Not in the catalog descriptions, not in the expert appraisals printed in clean columns, in the actual metal, in the gaps, the joints, the parts that didn't quite line up the way factory production was supposed to make them line up. The main floor was already filling up. Cole moved through the crowd slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, catalog folded under one arm, eyes traveling from car to car, the way his father had taught him. Don't start with the obvious. Start with what's been pushed to the edge. The flashy cars were up front. A 1967 Shelby GT500 under bright lights, a restored Alfa Romeo with its hood propped open like a trophy, a Porsche 911 in Guards red that a small crowd had already gathered around as if it were a painting in a museum. Cole gave them a respectful glance and kept walking. He found the car in the back corner of the exhibition floor, behind a temporary partition that had been set up to section off what the catalog diplomatically called additional inventory. In practice, it meant the cars that didn't make the front section, the ones without stories. The ones people walked past on their way to the Shelby. There were 4 of them back there. A beige sedan with obvious rust cancer along the sills. A muscle car with a replacement hood that didn't match the body color. Someone's partial project, abandoned. A station wagon that had no business being at a classic auction at all. And then, at the very end, pushed against the wall like it had been left there accidentally, a sports car. Cole stopped. It was small and low-slung, maybe from the mid to late 60s, with a body shape that didn't quite fit any production model he could immediately place. The color was hard to determine under the grime, something green, maybe, under layers of dust and oxidation that had turned the surface the color of old army surplus. One headlight cover was cracked. The interior, visible through the driver's window, showed a steering wheel with a cracked leather rim and gauges that Cole couldn't fully read from outside the glass. He stood there for a long moment, just looking. Then he crouched down. The undercarriage was visible from the side, and he tilted his head, studying the chassis geometry. Something about it nagged at him. The suspension pickup points were in the wrong place for a standard production car. Not wrong like someone had modified it, wrong like it had been designed that way deliberately, with a purpose he couldn't immediately identify. He stood back up and walked around the rear of the car, looking at the tail. The bodywork was hand-formed. He could see it in the subtle irregularities of the surface, the kind that meant aluminum beaten over a buck by a craftsman, not stamped out by a machine in a factory. His father had shown him the difference once, running a flashlight at a low angle across a body panel to read the surface. Machines make it flat. Hands make it alive. Cole didn't have a flashlight. He used his phone. He angled it low, moving slowly along the driver's side, and watched the light travel across the panel. Alive. Definitely alive. The surface had that almost imperceptible contour that meant hours of skilled handwork. Someone had made this car. Not assembled it, made it. He felt the beginning of something in his chest. Not excitement yet. Not quite. More like the feeling before excitement, when your brain is still catching up to what your instincts already know. You're wasting your time with that one. Cole looked up. A man in his mid-50s, catalog in hand, blazer with a small lapel pin that Cole didn't recognize, was looking at him with the mild condescension of someone who'd been attending these events long enough to feel entitled to opinions. "Didn't even make the main floor," the man added, nodding at the car. "Probably picked it up as part of a lot. No provenance, no history, no paperwork." "What's the estimate?" Cole asked. The man glanced at his catalog. 6,000 to 8,000. Essentially a floor price. Nobody's going to bid seriously on that. "What makes you say that?" The man gave Cole a look that was almost kind in the way that dismissiveness sometimes pretended to be. "Son, I've been collecting for 30 years. I know what a car worth looking at looks like. That," he said, gesturing at the dusty green machine, "is not it." He walked away. Cole looked back at the car. He crouched down again and looked at the chassis number. It was stamped into a plate on the firewall, nearly obscured by grime, but he could see enough characters to note them down on the back of his auction catalog. He photographed it with his phone. Then he photographed the suspension geometry, the rocker panels, the door gaps, which were tighter than they had any right to be on a car this dirty and neglected. Tight like precision, tight like intention. He spent 40 minutes with that car before the main crowd started filling in. The first time Natalie Ashcroft noticed Cole Bennett, she didn't actually notice him at all. She arrived at 11, which was when the serious collectors arrived, the ones who didn't need the extra hour to look because they had people who did the preliminary looking for them. She came in a black car with her assistant trailing her, wearing a coat that cost what Cole made in 2 months, and carrying a small leather-bound notebook where she apparently wrote her own observations rather than trust the printed catalog. Natalie Ashcroft was 30 years old and had been on the cover of 2 business magazines in the past year. She'd inherited a family real estate portfolio and then spent the following decade turning it into something unrecognizable: technology ventures, private equity, and a personal collection of classic automobiles that automotive journalists referred to as one of the most significant privately held collections in North America. She had taste, she had knowledge, and she was almost always right. She was also aware of both things, which was not exactly the same as being arrogant. It was something slightly different, a kind of confidence that had calcified over years of being correct often enough that being wrong had started to seem like someone else's problem. Cole was still near the back partition when Natalie's group moved through. He was taking a final photograph of the driver's door hinge when he heard her voice behind him. Clear, authoritative, the voice of someone who never had to repeat herself. "What on earth is that doing here?" He turned. She was looking at the green car with an expression that wasn't cruel but was completely decisive. The way someone looks at a wrong answer on a test. "Probably came with a lot," her assistant offered. "It looks like someone drove it into a pond and left it there for a decade." She tilted her head slightly, the way people do when they're performing a cursory examination rather than conducting a real one. No, this belongs in a scrapyard, not an auction floor. Move on. And they did. The whole group moved on, and within 30 seconds the car was forgotten again, the way it had apparently been forgotten for however many years it had spent wherever it had spent them before ending up in this corner of the Meridian Convention Center. Cole watched them go. He looked back at the car. He wrote one more thing in the margin of his catalog: hand-formed body, non-standard suspension geometry, chassis number prefix. Look up tonight. Then he went to get a bidder's paddle. The registration desk was staffed by a young woman who was professionally pleasant and who did not visibly react when Cole put down his driver's license and his debit card and said he wanted to register. The fee was $300. He paid it. $300 was his emergency fund for the month, the money he kept separate in a savings account for when Maya's school needed something unexpected or the truck needed a repair he hadn't planned for. He stood at the desk after she processed his card, and he thought, for just a moment, about what he was doing. He was a single father with a mortgage that was 3 months from being manageable and a decade away from being paid off. He had a daughter in the 4th grade who was starting to need things he hadn't anticipated. Not expensive things, but consistent things. The kind of steady financial floor that meant he couldn't afford to take stupid risks. He had a shop he rented with a month-to-month lease and a roster of regular customers who trusted him but who weren't making him rich. He also had 32 years of looking at cars. He had a father who'd spent 20 years in vintage motorsport restoration and who'd passed enough of it on to Cole, even in the years when Cole wasn't listening as carefully as he should have been. He had a specific feeling in his chest that he'd learned, over time, was worth paying attention to. The feeling that said, "This is not what it looks like." He took the paddle. The auction started at 11 with the big cars, the ones with 6-figure estimates and bidder wars that climbed in $20,000 increments, while the crowd murmured appreciatively. Cole watched from the side. He bid on nothing. He was waiting. The green car came up near the end of the session, right before the lunch break, when attention was beginning to drift, and half the room was already thinking about food. "Lot 47, the auctioneer announced, with the slightly subdued energy of a man moving through inventory he didn't expect much from. A sports car of uncertain provenance, estimated late 1960s construction. Condition as seen. We'll open the bidding at $5,000. Nobody bid. The auctioneer waited the appropriate number of seconds. $5,000. Do I have 5,000? Cole raised his paddle. In the row near the front, Natalie Ashcroft looked up from her phone. 5,000, thank you. Do I have 6? Silence. 5,000, going once. 5,000, going twice. 6, said a voice somewhere to Cole's left. He didn't look for it. He raised his paddle again. 7 from paddle 31. Do I have 8? Nothing. $7,000 going once. 7,000 going twice. The gavel came down. Sold to paddle 31. The sound was small. There was no applause. The auctioneer was already moving to the next item. Cole stood there with the paddle in his hand and felt the very specific feeling of having done something that couldn't be undone. $7,000. He didn't have $7,000 liquid. He had his debit card balance, which was not $7,000, and a credit card with a limit he'd been keeping carefully below for 2 years, and a decision he'd just made with his gut instead of his bank account. He was going to have to move some things around. He was going to figure it out. He always figured it out. The logistics of payment and transport took most of the afternoon. He arranged a 2-day window before the car needed to be moved, which gave him time to rent a flatbed trailer through a guy he knew from the shop, Tommy Vega, who owned a small fleet of equipment and who would do Cole a favor on short notice because Cole had once fixed his entire brake system at cost when Tommy was going through a divorce and couldn't afford to pay retail. He called Tommy from the parking lot. "Tell me you're not asking me to haul something from the auction," Tommy said, by way of greeting. "I need a flatbed. 2 days. Cole? It's an important car, Tommy. Every car is an important car to you. This one's actually important." There was a pause on the line. Tommy had known Cole for 6 years and had learned, imperfectly, to take seriously the particular flatness in Cole's voice when he wasn't being dramatic. "Fine," Tommy said. "Wednesday morning. Don't scratch my trailer." Cole picked Maya up from school that afternoon, and she could tell immediately that something had happened. She was perceptive that way, had been since she was small, as if some part of her had decided early on that she needed to pay extra attention to her father because there was only one parent to pay attention to. She climbed into the truck and looked at him sideways and said nothing for exactly 45 seconds, which was her version of patience. "You did something," she finally said. "I bought a car." She was quiet for a moment. "Is it a good car?" "I think it might be a very good car." "You think or you know?" He glanced at her. She was looking out the windshield with her arms crossed, 10 years old and already carrying herself like someone twice that age, something that Cole loved about her and also occasionally found quietly heartbreaking. "I know enough," he said. "Okay." She seemed to accept this. Then, after a pause, "How much?" $7,000. "Dad." Her voice was carefully neutral, which was worse than if she'd been upset. "I know. I know, Maya." She didn't push it. She turned and looked out the passenger window at the passing streets, and he could see the small tension in her shoulders that meant she was doing math in her head and not necessarily liking the results. "Tell me about it," she said finally. So he did. He told her about the suspension geometry, the hand-formed panels, the chassis number he'd photographed. He told her about what his grandfather, her great-grandfather, who died before she was born, had once said about factory-built prototypes, the small production runs that manufacturers made for racing programs, and then sometimes lost track of when programs ended or companies restructured. He told her about the way the door gaps were tight in a way that production cars weren't, because production cars were built to tolerances, not to perfection, and this car's gaps suggested perfection, or something close to it. She listened the way she always listened, face forward, not looking at him, absorbing it. She was like her mother that way. Rachel had listened like that too, like listening was a serious thing that deserved her full attention. "You really believe it's something," Maya said. "Yeah." Even though that lady at the auction said it was garbage. He told her about Natalie's comment, not to dwell on it, just as part of the story. He watched the road. She looked at it for about 4 seconds from 6 feet away. That's not the same as knowing. Maya thought about this. What if you're wrong? It was a fair question. It was the only question that mattered. "Then I'm wrong," he said, "and we figure it out." "Like we always do," she said, not quite a question. "Like we always do." She uncrossed her arms. The tension in her shoulders eased a fraction. She looked out the window again and said, "Okay, Dad," in the tone she used when she'd decided to trust him, which she always did even when the math didn't add up, and which always made him want to be worth it. That night, after Maya was in bed, Cole sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and the photographs from his phone and the chassis number he'd copied into his notes. He started with what he knew. The body style was closest to certain Italian coach-built sports cars from the late 60s. There was a family resemblance in the proportions, the fastback roofline, the way the nose was shaped. But the construction method was British in sensibility, the aluminum over-tube frame approach, the suspension geometry that echoed certain small British racing constructors of the period. It didn't fit neatly into either category, which was either the sign of something confused or something deliberate. He ran the chassis number prefix through 3 different databases, 2 of which required paid subscriptions that he didn't have, which meant he had to use the free versions that showed partial information. What he got back was partial, but interesting. The prefix didn't match any standard production run he could find, but it had a structure, a format, that resembled numbering systems used by 2 specific manufacturers in Britain during the late 1960s for internal development vehicles. Not customer cars. Factory cars. He wrote that down. Then he went looking for the historians. He knew 2 people who might be able to help. One was a man named Gerald Forsyth, who wrote for a vintage motorsport journal and who had helped Cole authenticate a Lotus component 3 years ago through a chain of emails that had taken 6 weeks, but ultimately produced a definitive answer. The other was a woman named Dr. Patricia Huang at a university in Vermont, whose specialty was mid-century European motorsport manufacturing and whose contact information Cole had never actually used because he'd never had a reason serious enough to justify emailing a university professor out of nowhere. He emailed both of them that night at 11:45, while the house was quiet around him. To Gerald, he wrote a detailed message: chassis prefix, photographs attached, description of the construction methods he'd observed, specific questions about the suspension geometry. To Dr. Huang, he wrote something shorter and more careful, knowing he was a stranger to her, explaining who he was and what he'd found and why he thought it might be worth her time. He hit send on both and sat for a moment in the kitchen quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Down the hall, he could hear the small sound of Maya's ceiling fan, which she ran even in winter because she said it helped her sleep. He thought about the car sitting in the convention center right now, alone in that back corner, waiting to be picked up. He thought about Natalie Ashcroft's voice. This belongs in a scrapyard. He thought about his father. Frank Bennett had died 4 years ago, quietly and without much warning, a heart attack at 61 in the shop he'd run for 27 years in a small town 2 hours north of Claremont. Cole had driven up and sat with him in the hospital for 3 days, during which Frank had been alternately unconscious and conversational. And during the conversational periods, they'd talked about cars more than anything else, because that was the language they had between them that worked without effort. His father had once spent 11 months restoring a car that turned out to be exactly what it claimed to be. A nice but ordinary 1959 Roadster. Not special, not rare, worth a respectable but not remarkable amount. He'd put the work in anyway, done it right, and when Cole had asked him once whether it bothered him that the car hadn't turned out to be something more, Frank had looked at him like the question was slightly missing the point. The looking is never wasted, he'd said, even when you're wrong about what you're looking at. You learned something, you added it to the pile, and one day the pile is big enough that you're not wrong anymore. Cole closed his laptop and went to bed. He lay there for a while in the dark and thought about piles of knowledge and rusted green sports cars and $7,000 he technically didn't have yet, and a 10-year-old girl down the hall who trusted him, and eventually he fell asleep. Gerald Forsythe replied at 6:17 the next morning, before Cole's alarm went off. The email was 3 paragraphs long and ended with a phone number and the words, "Call me before you do anything. I need to see the full photographs." Cole called at 7:30 after Maya left for school. Gerald answered on the second ring. He was in his late 60s, Cole knew, and he'd been writing about vintage motorsports since before Cole was born, and his voice carried the particular precision of someone who'd spent decades choosing words carefully because imprecision in this field was the same as being wrong. "Where did you find this?" was the first thing he said. "An auction in Claremont. It was in the back. Nobody bid on it seriously." A pause. "Nobody bid on it seriously." "I got it for $7,000. Another pause. Longer. "Cole, the chassis prefix you sent me. I want you to understand I'm not confirming anything yet. I want to be very clear about that." "I understand. But that prefix structure, the specific format of it, the way the letters and numbers are arranged, that is consistent, not confirmed, with a series of internal development vehicles produced by a British manufacturer in the late 1960s for an endurance racing program that was canceled before it competed." Cole's hand tightened around his phone. "Most of those vehicles were destroyed when the program ended," Gerald continued. "Standard practice. When a racing program is discontinued and the manufacturer doesn't want the technology to reach competitors, the cars are typically documented and then scrapped. But there were always stories, rumors really, that not all of them made it to the crusher, that 1 or 2 were sold privately, off the books, during a period of financial difficulty for the manufacturer. It was never proven. How many people know this story? In the circles I move in, perhaps a dozen. It's one of those peripheral mysteries that doesn't get written about because there's never been enough physical evidence to make it publishable." Gerald paused again. "Until possibly now. What do I need to do?" "Don't clean it. Don't touch the chassis plate. Don't show it to anyone you don't trust completely. And get me the full photograph set, every angle, close-ups of every panel join, the interior, the engine bay if you can access it without disturbing anything. I'm going to make some calls and see if Dr. Huang replies to you, because if she does, Her opinion and mine together carry enough weight that we can bring in the engineering authenticators. She hasn't replied yet. She will. Patricia doesn't ignore interesting things. A short pause, and then something that might have been the beginning of a smile in Gerald's voice. $7,000. My God, Cole. Too early to know, Cole said. Yes, it is. But the smile was still there. The car arrived at Cole's shop on Wednesday morning on Tommy's flatbed, eased down the ramp with the kind of slowness that Cole reserved for things he didn't want to damage. Tommy stood in the shop doorway drinking coffee and watching Cole direct the unloading with his arms. You're going to tell me what's special about it, Tommy said. Probably not yet, but something is. Cole guided the last foot of the car onto the shop floor and put a chock behind the rear wheel. Maybe. Go drink your coffee, Tommy. Tommy went back inside to the office. Cole stood alone in the shop with the green car on the floor in front of him. The morning light came in through the skylights and fell across the dusty body at an angle, and for a moment the surface was just surface, oxidized paint and grime and time. Then he angled his head slightly and caught the light differently. And underneath everything he could see the geometry of the thing, the way the panels met each other, the purposeful aggression of the proportions. He'd worked on hundreds of cars. He'd restored 3 vehicles from bare shells, including a pre-war roadster that had taken 2 years and which he'd ultimately sold for enough to pay off one of the smaller debts from the year Rachel died. He knew what cars looked like when they had nothing underneath the surface, and he knew what they looked like when they had everything. This car had everything. He just needed to prove it. He put on his work gloves and got to work. Not cleaning. Not yet. Documenting. He photographed every square inch of the exterior before touching anything, moving methodically with his phone, capturing the condition as found the way his father had taught him, because the as-found condition was part of the story, and the story was part of the value. Then, carefully, section by section, he began to clear the surface grime. He used a soft brush and a barely damp cloth, working in small sections, removing dust without disturbing what was underneath. The green emerged slowly, not the army surplus dullness of the oxidized surface, but something richer, a deeper British racing green that had been sitting under the top layer like a secret. The color came up cautiously, as if it wasn't sure yet whether it was safe to be seen. Under the driver's side rocker panel, behind a particularly thick accumulation of old road grime, Cole found a secondary marking. Not a chassis plate. Something different. Handwritten in a paint marker, faded to near invisibility but readable if he held his phone light at exactly the right angle. He read it twice, then a third time. He took photographs from 4 different angles. Then he sat back on his heels on the shop floor and let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding for quite a while. Dr. Patricia Huang replied that afternoon. Her email was professionally cautious in the way that academic emails always were. Careful qualifications, appropriate hedging, the measured language of someone who'd built a reputation on not overstating things. But the content underneath the caution was unmistakable. The chassis prefix was significant. The photographs he'd sent were compelling, and she would like to arrange an in-person inspection at her earliest convenience, which turned out to be Friday of that week, Cole replied. Friday works. I'll have the car available from 9 onward. He didn't tell her about the secondary marking yet. He wanted to see her face when she found it herself. On Thursday night, he sat at the kitchen table with Maya after dinner and told her where things stood. He laid it out as clearly as he could. What Gerald had said, what Dr. Huang had said, what the marking on the rocker panel might mean. He was careful not to promise her anything. He'd learned in the years since Rachel that promising Maya things he wasn't sure of was a debt he couldn't always pay. She listened in the same way she'd listened in the truck, arms crossed, face forward, absorbing it. So it might be worth a lot, she said. It might be worth quite a lot, if the authentication goes the right way. And if it doesn't? Then we have a nice old sports car for which I spent $7,000 and will spend some more on authentication, and which we will ultimately sell at a loss and figure out. Like we always do, she said again, and this time she looked at him when she said it, which was different from last time. Yeah, he said. She unfolded her arms. She picked up her fork and went back to her pasta. After a minute, she said without looking up, that woman at the auction is going to feel pretty dumb. Cole almost laughed. It caught him off guard, which was something Maya could still do regularly, which he counted as one of the better things in his life. Maybe, he said. She didn't even look at it properly, Maya said. 4 seconds and 6 feet away. That's what you said. That's what I said. That's not looking. That's glancing. She stabbed a piece of pasta with her fork with a precision that suggested she had opinions about this. There's a difference. There is a difference, Cole agreed. Friday morning, Gerald Forsyth drove 4 hours from his home, and Dr. Patricia Huang flew in from Vermont, and the two of them stood in Cole's shop in front of the green car for 3 hours and 20 minutes. Cole stayed out of the way mostly, answering questions when they were directed at him, handing over equipment when it was needed, watching two people who knew exactly what they were looking at look at a thing that he'd found by not walking past it. At 1:40 in the afternoon, Dr. Huang crouched beside the driver's side rocker panel with a magnifying loupe and a flashlight and went very still for almost a full minute. Then she stood up and looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment, which in Cole's experience was the loudest kind of communication. "Cole," Gerald said finally, with the careful voice of a man who was choosing every syllable. "We're going to need to bring in the engineering team before anything is official. You understand that? Nothing is confirmed until it's confirmed through proper process." "I understand," Cole said, "but I want you to hear me say, between the three of us in this room right now, that I have been in this field for 41 years. He paused. "And I have never personally stood in front of something like this." Cole looked at the car. The green was fully visible now in sections where he'd cleared the surface, and in the shop's morning light it had a depth to it that made it look less like paint and more like something living. The proportions were extraordinary when you could actually see them, that low, aggressive stance, the way the body seemed to be moving even at rest, the hand-formed panels that caught light in the way that machine-pressed metal simply couldn't. "Okay," Cole said. "Okay?" Gerald blinked at him. "I knew when I saw it." He said it simply, without drama, the way you state a fact. "I needed you to confirm it, and you've confirmed it. The next steps are the next steps." He looked at the car for another moment. "I'm just glad it's not in a scrapyard." Dr. Wang, who had not spoken since she'd looked at Gerald, made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else entirely. "Cole," she said, "I'm going to make some calls." The authentication took 11 days. During those 11 days, Cole kept working. Regular customers, regular jobs, brake replacements, a timing belt, an electrical fault in a late-model SUV that took him 2 days to isolate. He kept the green car in the shop under a cloth cover, documented and photographed and cared for but not disturbed, waiting. He got 3 phone calls from private collectors he didn't know, through channels he couldn't quite trace, offering him money for the car sight unseen. The first offer was $60,000. The second was $120,000. The third was an unnamed figure delivered through an intermediary who said his client was serious and prepared to move quickly. Cole told all 3 of them the same thing. It's not for sale privately. He told Maya about the calls that night. She thought about it for a moment. "Why not just take the money?" she asked. Not accusing, genuinely curious. "Because it's worth more than that," he said. "And because, more importantly, the story is worth telling the right way." She squinted at him slightly. "What does that mean?" He thought about how to explain it. "If I sell it in private to someone with money who found out through the grapevine, it disappears. Into a collection somewhere. Nobody knows it existed. The car doesn't get to be what it actually is. And if you put it in an auction, then everyone sees it. Everyone knows. The car gets to tell its own story in front of the people who understand what it means." He paused. "And we get a fair price instead of whatever someone thinks they can talk me into." Maya considered this. She had her mother's habit of considering things fully before responding, which Rachel had called thinking before you speak, and which Maya seemed to have absorbed by some process of proximity or inheritance. "Okay," she said at last. "That makes sense." "You sure?" "I said it makes sense, Dad. I meant it." On the 11th day, Gerald called. The authentication was complete. The engineering team had confirmed the chassis, the components, the construction methods. The secondary marking Cole had found on the rocker panel had been cross-referenced with archival records that Dr. Huang had located through a contact at a British motorsport archive. Records that confirmed the specific production sequence, the dates, and the destination of the vehicle when it had left the factory. It was real. It was exactly what Cole had thought it was from the first moment he'd crouched in that back corner of the Meridian Convention Center and tilted his phone flashlight at the side panel and felt the thing that he'd learned to trust over 32 years of looking at cars. He sat in his shop after the call ended, on an overturned crate next to the covered green car, in the quiet of the building with the traffic sounds coming in faint from the street outside. He thought about his father. He thought about $7,000 on a credit card and the look on Maya's face in the truck and a woman's voice saying, "This belongs in a scrapyard," without actually looking. He thought about what comes next. Then he got up, took out his phone, and called Gerald back. "I want to enter it in the Harrington International," he said. A pause on the line. The Harrington International was one of the 3 or 4 most significant classic and collector car auctions in the world. It was held in 2 months. Getting a car into it required a vetting process and a reputation and a story compelling enough to justify the catalog space. "You understand the timeline," Gerald said. "Can you help me make it work?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Yes," Gerald said. "I think I can." Cole hung up. He reached over and put one hand on the cloth cover, resting it there for a moment on the shape of the car beneath. "All right," he said quietly, to the car, or maybe to himself, or maybe to no one in particular. "Let's do this right." The 2 months between Gerald's phone call and the Harrington International were the strangest of Cole's life, and that was saying something, because the year Rachel died had contained some genuinely strange months. It wasn't that things were bad. Things were, by any reasonable measure, going better than they had in years. The authentication documentation was solid, Gerald was working his contacts, and Dr. Huang had agreed to co-sign the provenance report, which meant the car was entering the Harrington with the kind of scholarly backing that turned skeptics into believers before they even reached the auction floor. Cole knew all of this. He understood, intellectually, that the situation was favorable. He still couldn't sleep past 4 in the morning. He'd lie in the dark and run numbers in his head, not the potential auction numbers, which were too abstract to be useful, but the real numbers, the ones that actually governed his life. The shop lease, Maya's school fees for the following year, the credit card balance that now included the $7,000 for the car, the $300 for the auction registration, and an additional $1,400 in expenses he'd run up during the authentication process. Travel costs for Gerald and Dr. Huang that Cole had insisted on covering himself, equipment rentals, the archival research fees that Patricia had paid out of pocket, and that Cole had paid back within the week because he didn't take things for free. Total exposure, roughly $9,000 on top of his existing load. It wasn't catastrophic. He'd been in tighter spots, but it was the kind of number that, at 4 in the morning, had a way of expanding to fill whatever mental space you gave it. He got up most mornings before the alarm, made coffee, and went out to the shop. The green car lived there now, under a fitted cover he'd bought specifically for it, on the center lift where the lighting was best. He wasn't working on it. That had been a conscious decision from the beginning. The car was staying as found, which was the technically correct approach, and also the emotionally correct one, because there was a version of him that wanted to take it apart and put it back together perfectly, and that version of him had to be resisted. The car's story was in its original condition. Touching it beyond documentation would be the same as editing someone else's words, but he visited it. He stood with his coffee in the early morning and looked at it through the cover, the way you look at something that you can't quite believe is in your possession. Tommy noticed the visits. Tommy noticed most things that happened in the shop because he had a gift for being present without being intrusive, a quality Cole had come to value enormously over 6 years of professional friendship. "You go out there every morning," Tommy said, one Tuesday in October, leaning in the doorway between the office and the main floor with his own coffee. "Even before you start the day." "Good light in the morning," Cole said. "Uh-huh." Tommy sipped his coffee. "How's the documentation going?" "Almost complete. Gerald wants one more round of photographs from underneath, specific suspension component angles, and then the submission package is done." When does it go in? End of the week. Tommy nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you know what I've been thinking about? I usually don't until you tell me. That woman at the auction, the one who said it was garbage. Cole looked at him. I looked her up, Tommy said. Ashcroft. She's been on the cover of things. She has a collection that people apparently write articles about. He paused. She's going to be at the Harrington, isn't she? It wasn't really a question. Probably, Cole said. Tommy seemed to think about this. You worried about that? Why would I be worried about that? I don't know. She's got a lot of influence in those circles. She says a thing and people listen. If she decided she wanted to make things difficult, she's not going to make things difficult, Cole said. The authentication is solid. Gerald and Patricia signed it. The documentation is going through the Harrington's own vetting process. Her opinion of the car doesn't change the facts. Tommy turned his coffee cup in his hands. Okay, he said. She looked at it for 4 seconds, Cole said, from 6 feet away. I know. I'm not worried about her. Okay, Cole. He wasn't entirely sure that was true, but he said it anyway, and sometimes saying things was the start of making them true. The Harrington vetting process took 3 weeks, during which Cole received 2 calls from their acquisitions team, answered 37 emailed questions with full documentation, and submitted photographs numbering in the hundreds. The process was thorough in the way that only institutions with reputations worth protecting could be thorough, and Cole answered every question with the same careful precision he'd used in the authentication phase. On a Wednesday in late October, an email arrived from the Harrington International's Director of Acquisitions, a man named Andrew Calloway, informing Cole that Lot 112, the 1968 factory racing prototype, had been accepted for the upcoming catalog and would be featured in the published preview materials. Cole read the email twice at his kitchen table. Then he forwarded it to Gerald. Then he put his phone face down on the table and sat there for a minute. Maya came out of her room with wet hair and a bowl of cereal and sat down across from him and looked at his face. What happened? She said. It got accepted. The Harrington. She set her bowl down. She looked at him with an expression that was trying to remain calm and not entirely succeeding, which was the most emotion he'd seen from her on the subject since the truck conversation 2 months ago. So it's happening, she said. It's happening. She nodded once. Then she picked up her spoon and went back to her cereal. After a moment, she said without looking up, Okay. Good. That's it? Okay, good. What do you want me to say, Dad? I don't know. Maybe something that acknowledges this is kind of a big deal. She looked up. Her expression had settled into something that was almost but not quite a smile, the particular expression that meant she was feeling something she didn't have vocabulary for yet, or that she had vocabulary for but wasn't ready to use in front of him. It's a big deal, she said. Thank you. You're welcome. She went back to her cereal, then, after another pause, I knew it was going to happen. You did? You believed in it. You always figure out the right things to believe in. She said it simply, without sentimentality, as a statement of observed fact. It landed on Cole with a weight that he wasn't entirely prepared for, and he had to look away at the window for a moment before he trusted his face enough to look back at her. Finish your cereal, he said. I am finishing it. The preview catalog dropped in the first week of November, digital and print, and the reaction was immediate in a way that Cole hadn't anticipated, even though Gerald had tried to prepare him for it. The car was the cover image of the digital preview, not the main feature. That was a significant pre-war Grand Prix car that had its own documented racing history. But it was the cover, which in the Harrington's language meant it was the story. The photograph they used was one that Cole had taken himself in his shop in morning light, with the car still dusty and unrestored, sitting exactly as he'd found it. The deliberate choice to show it unrestored, as found, as authenticated, was Gerald's recommendation, and Cole had agreed immediately, because it was right. Because the point wasn't what the car could be made to look like. The point was what it actually was. Gerald had written the catalog essay himself, 1,400 words of precise, measured prose that laid out the discovery, the authentication process, and the significance of the find without overselling any of it, which somehow made it more convincing than overselling would have. Cole read the essay 3 times. It was strange to read the story of something that had happened to him in language that made it feel like history. He supposed that's what it was. The calls started the morning the preview dropped. Not private collector calls this time. Those had slowed once word got out that the car was going to the Harrington. These were media calls. 2 automotive journalism outlets wanted interviews. A podcast that covered vintage motorsport wanted a longer conversation. A mainstream news outlet picked up the story on the angle of the single-father mechanic who'd found a multi-million-dollar car in an auction back corner, which was the human interest version of the story, and which Cole was ambivalent about but ultimately agreed to because Gerald told him that public awareness was not his enemy. The interview ran on a Tuesday. Cole answered questions for 40 minutes at his shop, on the phone, while Tommy sat in the office with the door closed so Cole could have privacy and periodically slid handwritten notes under the door that said things like "Don't mention the credit card" and "You looked good in the photo they used." The photograph they used was the one from outside the shop. Cole in his navy jacket, standing at the open bay door with the covered car barely visible behind him. He looked, he thought, like someone who knew what he was doing, which he supposed was accurate. The story generated an amount of online engagement that Cole found genuinely disorienting. He didn't check social media regularly and hadn't prepared for the particular sensation of being a stranger to thousands of people who had opinions about his life. Most of the opinions were positive, or at least enthusiastic. A subset of them were skeptical in ways that were probably fair. A smaller subset had things to say about Natalie Ashcroft's original assessment of the car, which Cole refused to engage with directly and which made him quietly uncomfortable, because whatever she'd said and however wrong she'd been, he didn't particularly want to be the reason someone got piled on. He mentioned this to Gerald, who told him not to worry about things he couldn't control. He mentioned it to Maya, who said, "You didn't make anyone say anything. You can't control what people do." Then she went back to her homework, because she was 10 and had math due the next day and had correctly prioritized. What Cole did not know, during those weeks, was that Natalie Ashcroft had read the catalog essay. She'd been in Tokyo when the preview dropped, meeting with investors about a venture that had nothing to do with cars, and her assistant had flagged it in her morning briefing because anything related to the Harrington was relevant to her calendar. She'd read it on her laptop in her hotel room at 6 in the morning, Japanese time, with green tea going cold on the desk beside her. She read it once quickly, the way she read most things. Then she went back and read it again more slowly, which was not something she often did. The chassis prefix in the authentication documentation. She knew that prefix. Not well, not from deep expertise in that specific area of motorsport history, but she'd encountered it once, peripherally, in research she'd done 3 years ago when she'd been considering acquiring a different car that ultimately hadn't worked out. She'd noted it and filed it and hadn't thought about it again. It wasn't her specialty. British racing prototypes from the late 60s were adjacent to her main areas of knowledge rather than central to them. She set the laptop down and picked up her tea, which was cold. She sat for a moment with the cold tea and thought about a dusty green car in the back corner of the Meridian Convention Center and a man she'd been barely aware of crouching beside it with his phone while she'd walked past and said what she'd said. She didn't feel good about it. She also didn't feel as bad about it as perhaps she should have, which she noted honestly without judging herself too harshly, because she knew herself well enough to know that self-flagellation was not the same as actually changing anything. She picked up her phone and called her assistant. "Block the week of the Harrington," she said. "Full week. You're already confirmed for the preview reception and the first day." "Block the full week." There was a brief pause. "Done. Anything else?" "Find out what you can about Cole Bennett. Professional background, shop, public record. Not gossip. Actual information." Another pause. "And get me the full provenance documentation for Lot 112 if it's publicly available through the Harrington." She put the phone down and looked out the window at Tokyo in the early morning light. She had made the wrong call. That happened, rarely, and it had happened here, and the correct response was to understand exactly how and why it had happened, so she didn't make the same mistake in the same way again. That was the professional response. That was what she told herself. The other part of it, the part that wasn't professional, that was simply human and slightly uncomfortable, was that she'd said what she'd said in front of a room full of people, publicly and casually, and with the kind of confidence that made people remember what you'd said because you'd clearly expected to be right. She didn't like being wrong. She especially didn't like being demonstrably wrong in front of witnesses. She picked up her laptop and read the catalog essay a third time. Back in Claremont, Cole had started receiving something he hadn't fully anticipated: inquiries from young mechanics, not about the car specifically, about him, about the shop, about his background, about whether he took apprentices or offered any kind of mentorship arrangement. He had no system for handling these. He'd gotten 7 emails and 2 phone calls in the 2 weeks following the news article, and he'd answered all of them personally, imperfectly, typing responses at the kitchen table at night after Maya was in bed, trying to be honest about what he could and couldn't offer. He couldn't pay anyone. He had one bay he could share. He had evenings and weekends and a willingness to show people things he knew. 3 of them came in person. A 20-year-old named Diego who drove 45 minutes from across the county and who was currently doing oil changes at a chain shop and hating every minute of it. A woman named Carla, 24, who had taught herself most of what she knew from online forums and who brought a binder of her own project documentation that was so thorough it embarrassed Cole slightly. And a 17-year-old named Sam who showed up on a Saturday morning without calling first, stood in the shop doorway with his hands in his pockets and said, "I saw the thing about you. I want to learn how to really look at cars." Cole had sent Diego and Carla home with a standing invitation to come by on weekends if they wanted to, no commitments, just to be in the space and learn by proximity the way Cole had learned from his father. He'd been in that position himself once, and he understood the value of being allowed to watch someone who knew what they were doing. Sam he had kept talking to for an hour, because there was something in the kid's directness that reminded him of something he couldn't immediately name. He eventually placed it, himself, at 17, the summer his father had first let him strip a carburetor solo and trust the result. "Come back Saturday," Cole told him. "Really?" "Saturday morning, 8 o'clock. Don't be late." Sam had not been late. The week before the Harrington, Cole drove to Maya's school for a parent-teacher conference that had been scheduled 2 months ago and that he'd been slightly dreading because Maya's teacher, a careful woman named Mrs. Okafor, had mentioned in her last quarterly note that Maya sometimes withdrew from group activities, and Cole wasn't sure how to feel about that. He sat in the small chair across from Mrs. Okafor's desk, and she said things that were measured and kind, and that added up to, Maya was doing very well academically, better than well, and she was quiet in class but not troubled, and the withdrawal from group activities was less about difficulty and more about Maya's clear preference for working independently and her tendency to have already thought through things that other kids were still working out. "She's a very deliberate child," Mrs. Okafor said. "She thinks before she commits to things. That's actually relatively rare at her age." "Her mother was like that," Cole said. Mrs. Okafor nodded. She seemed to understand that this was not a detour but the most direct path to answering her question. "She talks about the car sometimes," she added. "Does she?" "She doesn't brag about it. She explains it. There's a difference. She told the class about the authentication process, the steps, the documentation, why you left it unrestored." She looked at him steadily. "She's very proud of you. But it's a specific kind of pride. It's not about the money." Cole held that for a moment. "She understands that it's about the looking," he said. "Yes, that's exactly what she said, actually. Almost those words." He drove home from the school conference and sat in the truck in the driveway for a few minutes. The front light was on. Maya had turned it on before he left. She always turned it on, every time he went out after dark, so he'd have light when he came back, even though she was 10 and couldn't stay up late enough to see him return. He went inside. She was asleep. He stood in her doorway for a moment in the dark, listening to the ceiling fan. He thought, I need to make this count, not for the numbers, not for the story, for her. He'd been thinking that since the day he bought the car. He thought it again now, more clearly, with the school conference still fresh. He went to bed. The night before the Harrington, Cole drove the car to the venue himself. Not on the flatbed. The car moved under its own power for the first time in his ownership, coaxed to life over 2 careful sessions in the shop with Gerald present. The engine turning over with a sound that Gerald had described as extraordinary, and that Cole had described as right, because right was the only word that fit. He'd done nothing to the engine mechanically. He'd simply ensured the lubrication was adequate, the fuel system was clean enough to function, and that nothing would be damaged by starting it. The car had started. It had sounded right. He drove it to the Harrington venue, a converted exhibition space in a city 2 hours from Claremont, at 8 in the evening, following Tommy in the truck for backup, taking secondary roads instead of the highway because the speed differential between the old car and modern traffic was not something he wanted to negotiate. The car drove with a stiffness that was vintage but purposeful, nothing like a road car, everything like what it was. A machine built for a specific purpose in a specific period, driven carefully into an entirely different world. Maya had asked to come. He told her the venue wouldn't allow children during the pre-event setup. She'd accepted this with the equanimity she applied to most disappointing information, which was to say she'd gone quiet for a moment and then said, okay, and then gone back to whatever she'd been doing. He'd felt the absence of complaint more acutely than complaint would have felt, which was one of Maya's particular talents. The truth was that the venue would have allowed her. The truth was that he wanted this specific moment, the arrival, the handover, the car rolling into the space where its story was going to be told, to be something he processed quietly, without worrying about her reaction or making sure she was okay or being a father. Just a man with a car that had cost him everything he had, in a building full of people who were about to find out what it was worth. Tommy walked beside him through the delivery entrance. "How's she running?" Tommy asked, nodding back at the car. "She's running." "That's a yes?" "That's a yes." The Harrington staff were professional and efficient. The car was logged in, positioned, documented, and covered. Cole stayed for 40 minutes to answer questions from their technical team and then signed the necessary paperwork and walked back out through the delivery entrance. The night air was cold. His breath showed in it. Tommy handed him a coffee from a thermos he'd apparently been keeping in the truck cab. "She's in," Tommy said. "She's in." They stood there for a minute in the parking lot, 2 men and a thermos of coffee and the cold November air. "You nervous?" Tommy asked. Cole drank his coffee. He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about most things. "Yeah," he said. "Good," Tommy said. "Means it matters." Cole said nothing. He drank his coffee and looked up at the sky, which was clear and very dark and full of stars in the way that city skies usually weren't, because they were outside the city center and the light pollution thinned out here. He thought about Gerald, who had driven in that afternoon and was staying at a hotel 2 blocks from the venue. He thought about Patricia Huang, who had flown in and who had texted him at 6 that evening to say she'd reviewed the presentation documentation one final time and everything was correct and clean and he had nothing to worry about on that front. He thought about the private collector calls he'd refused, $120,000. He'd said no. At the time it had felt obvious. In this parking lot at 9:40 in the evening, with nothing in his hands but a thermos lid and the memory of $9,000 in credit card debt, it felt slightly less obvious, and he sat with that honesty for a moment because he'd learned that honesty in the dark was usually healthier than false certainty in the light. He'd made the right call. He believed that. He was also nervous, and the nervousness didn't invalidate the belief. It just occupied the same space alongside it. "Come on," Tommy said. "I'll drive." "You look like you need to not be driving." Cole got in the passenger seat. On the drive back, he called Maya. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake and waiting, which meant the whole okay. Dad composure from earlier in the week had been exactly what he'd suspected. Performance. The performance of a 10-year-old who'd learned that not worrying her father was one of the ways she could look after him. "She's in," he said. A silence. Then, "Good. You should be asleep." "I was reading." "Maya." "I'm going. Is she okay? Did anything happen on the drive?" "Nothing happened on the drive. She ran well." Another silence, shorter. "I told Mrs. Okafor today that I think she's going to sell for a lot." "Oh yeah? What did Mrs. Okafor say?" "She said she believed me." A pause. "I told her I believe in you, so it's basically the same thing." Cole pressed his mouth together and looked out the passenger window at the dark road going past. "Get some sleep," he said. I am. Good night, Dad. Good night, Bug. He hung up and sat with his phone in his lap and the road going dark under the headlights, and Tommy saying nothing in the seat beside him, which was exactly right. The next morning, the Harrington preview reception opened at 10. By 9:15, Cole was already there. He stood near the back of the room as the doors opened and the crowd began filtering in. And it was a different crowd than the Meridian had been. Older money, quieter money. Museum representatives with lanyards, collectors who arrived with assistants carrying research folders, a few younger faces, competitive bidders from technology and finance who'd built collections over the past decade. Press with credentials on lanyards, 2 camera operators set up discreetly in the corners. The room built slowly and then all at once, the way these things always do. Cole watched the green car. It sat in the center of the main floor now, under gallery lighting that had been designed specifically for vehicle display. Warm, but precise. The kind of light that revealed surface rather than obscuring it. The car was still unrestored, still as found, the dusty green and original patina and the cracked headlight cover all present and accounted for, because that was the truth of it, and the truth was the whole point. He watched people's faces as they approached it for the first time. The reactions were not what a stranger would have expected. There was no immediate excitement, no gasps or wide eyes. The people at the Harrington knew better than that. What he saw instead was something quieter, and in his opinion more genuine. The particular stillness that comes over someone who is looking at something and revising their expectations mid-look. The slight pause, the tilt of the head, the person turning to their companion and saying something in a lowered voice, the person who'd started to walk past and then stopped and come back. Gerald found him at 10:40, working through a small plate of food from the reception buffet with the efficiency of a man who'd attended enough of these events to know that eating before the action started was practical rather than rude. "How's the floor reading?" Cole asked. "Well," Gerald said without embellishment. He was looking across the room at the car. "The museum representatives from Geneva have been there twice. The fellow from the Racing Archive in Stuttgart has been photographing the suspension from 3 different angles. The bidder from Hong Kong, Don't Look 11 o'clock, gray suit, has been making calls for the past half hour." Cole did not look at 11 o'clock. "What's the conversation about the estimate?" he asked. Gerald had been in contact with the Harrington's internal team throughout the vetting process, and he had a sense of the room that Cole couldn't fully access from his own position. "They've revised it twice since the catalog dropped," Gerald said. "The preview response has been beyond what they modeled. They're currently guiding conservatively in the 2 to 3 million range, which I believe is a deliberate underestimate designed to create floor momentum." Cole absorbed this. $2 to $3 million. He'd known the numbers were in that range. Gerald had prepared him, Patricia had prepared him, the authentication documentation had made the value clear. He'd known. Hearing it said out loud in a room where it was real was different from knowing. "Okay," he said. "You're going to be fine," Gerald said. "I know." "You don't look like you know." "I look like a mechanic who spent $7,000 on a hunch and is now standing at the Harrington International hoping his daughter was right." Gerald looked at him for a moment. Then he did something Cole hadn't expected. He laughed, a genuine one, short but real, the laugh of a man who'd been in this field for 40 years and hadn't expected to be surprised by it. "Yes," Gerald said. "That's about right." He touched Cole's arm briefly, the kind of gesture older men made when they meant something they weren't going to put into words. "Eat something. The auction's tomorrow." Cole ate something. He was at the buffet table when he felt, rather than saw, someone stop nearby. The particular quality of stillness that meant someone had stopped with a purpose. He looked up. Natalie Ashcroft was standing 4 feet away, holding a glass of water, looking at him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. She was taller than he'd registered at the Meridian, or maybe it was just that here, in this context, she was looking at him directly rather than past him. She didn't say anything right away. He didn't either. The moment stretched out to the point where it became a choice about who was going to speak first, and Cole waited because he genuinely didn't know what to say and was not going to say something wrong just to fill the air. She spoke first. "The car looks different in good light," she said. "It was always the same car," he said. She accepted that without flinching, which he noted. I know. Another pause. I'm told the authentication is comprehensive, she said. Gerald Forsyth and Dr. Patricia Huang signed the provenance report. Their methodology is documented in the submission package. I read the submission package. Her eyes moved to the car briefly and then back to him. You're not going to say I was wrong. I don't need to say it. No, she said. You don't. She looked at him for another moment, and he could see something working behind her eyes. Not discomfort exactly, but the particular expression of someone confronting a thought they'd rather not have in public. I said what I said in front of a room full of people. That matters. What you say in front of people matters to you, Cole said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. Yes, she said. It does. A pause. Apparently what I see in 4 seconds from 6 feet away also matters. That's a more difficult thing to sit with. He looked at her. He thought about Maya saying, that's not looking, that's glancing. There's a difference. He thought about his father. He thought about the specific loneliness of being right about something before anyone else can see it, and the specific relief when the world catches up. The car was always there, he said. It just needed someone to look at it long enough. She didn't respond to that right away. She looked across the room at the green car under the gallery lights, the authentic, unrestored original survivor, the thing that had lived in dust and obscurity for decades and was now the center of one of the most significant auction events of the year. I'll be here tomorrow, she said finally, for the auction. Most people will be. Yes. She looked back at him. Good luck, Mr. Bennett, though I don't think you need it particularly. She walked away. Cole stood at the buffet table with a half-eaten plate of food and watched her go. He wasn't sure what to make of what had just happened. It hadn't been an apology. Not quite. Not yet. It had been something earlier than an apology. The stage before. The acknowledgement that there was something to apologize for, spoken by someone who was clearly still deciding how to cross that specific distance. He turned back to the food. Gerald materialized beside him from somewhere. Was that Ashcroft? Gerald said. Yeah. What did she want? Cole thought about it. To look, he said. Properly this time. Gerald considered this. And I think she's starting to see it, Cole said. He put down the plate. He looked once more across the room at the green car, lit and still and waiting, carrying its history with the patience of something that had waited a long time already, and had learned that patience was not the same as surrender. Tomorrow, the bidding would start. Tonight, the car just sat there and let itself be seen. Cole didn't sleep well the night before the auction. He'd known he wouldn't. He'd booked a room at a mid-range hotel 6 blocks from the venue. Nothing fancy, a room with a bed and a desk and a window that looked out at a parking structure. And he'd lain in the dark for most of the night doing the thing he'd told himself he wouldn't do, which was run numbers. Not the auction numbers. He'd made a deliberate rule about that weeks ago. Don't calculate the outcome, because you can't control the outcome, and calculating it just burns energy you need for the parts you can control. The numbers he ran instead were the smaller ones, the life-sized ones. The credit card balance, the lease payment due in 3 weeks, Maya's winter coat, which she'd outgrown, and which they hadn't replaced yet because she'd said she was fine, and he'd let her say it because the timing was bad. A winter coat. He was lying in a hotel room the night before one of the most significant auctions in the collector car world, waiting to find out if a car he'd bought for $7,000 was going to change his life. And he was thinking about a winter coat. He didn't find this ironic. He found it clarifying. At 4:40, he gave up on sleep and showered and made coffee from the in-room machine, which produced something that tasted like the idea of coffee rather than coffee itself, and sat at the desk by the window and called Maya. She answered immediately. No sleep fog, no half-awake confusion. She'd been awake. You weren't sleeping either, he said. I was reading, she said, with less conviction than usual. Maya. Fine. I wasn't sleeping. A brief pause. Are you okay? I'm fine. I just wanted to hear your voice. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, less composed, younger, more like what she actually was at 10 years old rather than the version of herself she performed for him Most of the time. Dad, what if it doesn't go well? Define doesn't go well. What if nobody bids? What if the authentication isn't? What if people decide it isn't enough? What if? Maya. He kept his voice level. The authentication is solid. Gerald signed it. Patricia signed it. The Harrington accepted it through their own process. The car is what it is regardless of what happens today. But the money, if we walk away with $2 million, we're fine. If we walk away with 3, we're better than fine. If something goes wrong and we walk away with $500,000, he paused because this was the one he hadn't worked through all the way. Then we're okay. Not fine, but okay, and we figure out the rest. Like we always do, she said, automatically, the way the phrase had become a reflex between them over the past months. Like we always do. She breathed out slowly through the phone. Okay. Get a couple more hours if you can. Tommy's picking you up at 9. I know. He texted me last night. He said to wear something nice. Good advice. I know. I ironed my dress already. A pause. The blue one. Cole closed his eyes briefly. The blue dress was the one she'd worn to Rachel's memorial 3 years ago, and once to a school concert after that, and she'd been smaller then, and the fact that it still fit was one of those small mercies that he tried to notice when they appeared. You're going to look great, he said. I know, she said, with the particular matter-of-fact confidence that was entirely her own, and that always made him want to laugh. I'll see you there. He hung up and sat with the bad coffee and the dark window and the parking structure, and thought about the fact that in approximately 6 hours everything was going to be decided, one way or another, and there was nothing left for him to do except show up. He put on his good jacket, the navy one, the one Maya had saved up for. He walked to the venue in the cold morning air. The Harrington International Auction occupied the main exhibition hall of the convention center, a space that had been transformed overnight from reception venue into something that felt, to Cole, like a cross between a theater and a courtroom. Rows of upholstered chairs faced the auctioneer's podium. On the perimeter, elevated phone bidding stations were staffed by Harrington representatives in dark suits. Along the walls, screens displayed the current lot, the bidding progress, and real-time translations in 4 languages because the room contained people from at least a dozen countries. Cole arrived at 8:15, 90 minutes before the auction opened. The floor was still being prepared. Staff moved with quiet efficiency. The cars were already in position, each one on its numbered platform, each one lit, each one carrying the specific atmosphere of something that was about to be assigned a permanent public value. The green car was Lot 112, which meant it would come up in the second session after the lunch break. Cole had known this from the schedule and had tried to prepare himself for the waiting, which was always the hardest part. He was moderately successful at this. Gerald found him near the main entrance, already in his suit, catalog in hand, looking like a man who'd attended enough of these events that they'd stopped being occasions and become simply his environment. How are you? Gerald asked. I slept about 2 hours. That's roughly what I expected. He handed Cole a coffee, real coffee, from somewhere, in a proper cup. The room is going to fill by 9:30. By 10, it's going to be loud. The bidders for your lot are going to be spread across the room, and the phone stations and possibly remote bidding. They set up a digital channel this morning, which they don't do for every lot. That's a signal. Cole took the coffee. How many serious bidders do you think? For something like this? 6 to 10 who have actually done the work and know what they're looking at. Maybe double that who will participate in the early bidding on momentum alone. The serious money will come from a smaller group. I'd estimate 4, maybe 5 people who've been specifically preparing for this lot. You know who they are? Some of them. Gerald looked across the floor toward the car. The Geneva Museum has an acquisitions budget and a mandate. The Hong Kong bidder from yesterday. His name is Lawrence Chin. He's built one of the most significant private collections in Asia over the past 15 years, and he doesn't lose things he decides he wants. There's a foundation in Texas, anonymously represented, that I believe has been tracking this car since the authentication report went public. He paused. And Ashcroft. Cole looked at him. You think she's bidding? I think she's capable of it. Whether she will... Gerald shook his head slightly. She's harder to read than most. Cole thought about the buffet table conversation from the night before. The car looks different in good light. Her expression as she'd looked across the room at the car, not the cursory glance of someone performing appreciation, but something genuinely attentive, the look of someone who is recalibrating. She looked at it properly last night, Cole said. Yes, I noticed. If she bids, it won't be about the car, not entirely. Gerald considered this. No, probably not entirely. He picked up his coffee cup. Does that matter? Cole thought about it honestly. No, he said. It doesn't. Tommy arrived at 9:20 with Maya, who walked into the main hall in her blue dress and her winter coat. She was wearing the old one, the too small one, with the sleeves riding up her wrists, and looked around the room with the wide-eyed composure of someone who wanted to appear like this wasn't the most impressive space she'd ever been in. She mostly succeeded. Cole saw the moment the ceiling height registered, the slight tilt of her head, and then the deliberate reset of her expression. She found him across the room and walked directly to him, which was very Maya. It's big, she said. It is. Where's the car? He pointed. She looked. For a moment she was just a 10-year-old girl looking at an old green car, and then she was whatever more complex thing she actually was, her face going through a sequence of expressions he didn't have names for. It looks right here, she said. In this room. Yeah, Cole said. It does. Tommy, who had come to stand beside him, put a hand on Cole's shoulder briefly without saying anything. Then he went to find seats. The room filled. By 10 it was exactly what Gerald had predicted. Loud in the way that wealthy rooms are loud. Not boisterous, but dense. Full of the particular energy of people who were going to spend serious money before the day was out, and who had the kind of confidence that came with that. Cole moved through it carefully, not pushing, not performing. He'd learned at the Meridian that this was not his natural environment, and he'd stopped trying to pretend otherwise. He was a mechanic from Claremont in a navy jacket. That was what he was. He spotted Natalie Ashcroft at 10:20 in the third row on the left side, with an assistant in the seat beside her and a second assistant at the phone bidding station along the wall. Stationed there early, Cole noted, which meant she was set up to bid either from her seat or through the station. A double channel. That was not something you set up unless you were serious. She didn't look at him, or if she did, she didn't acknowledge it. He found his own seat, 2 rows behind her and to the right. The first session ran from 10:30 to 12:45, covering lots 1 through 89. The pre-war Grand Prix car came up in the first session and generated an extended bidding war that ultimately resolved at $4.2 million, which the room absorbed with a round of applause and then immediately moved on from, because there was more to come. Cole watched the first session with genuine attention, not just waiting for his own lot, but watching the room's rhythm, the way the auctioneer managed momentum, the tells on the bidder paddles and phone station operators that indicated when someone was serious versus when they were positioning. He didn't learn anything from this that he could apply directly, but watching helped. It used the part of his brain that would otherwise have been running the numbers again. Maya sat next to him through the first session, mostly still, occasionally asking him quiet questions that he answered in a low voice. She wanted to understand the bidding mechanics, the increments, the phone stations, the way the auctioneer read the room. He explained what he could. She nodded, absorbed it, filed it. At one point, she leaned over and said, very quietly, "The woman in the third row, that's her, isn't it?" Cole didn't look at Natalie. "Yeah. She has 2 people set up to bid." He looked at Maya. "How did you know that?" "The woman at the phone station has a tablet with the bid number already up. She keeps looking at the woman in the third row." Maya looked at him. "She's going to bid." "Maybe. That's good, right? More bidders means higher price." "That's the theory." "Okay." She went back to watching the auctioneer. The lunch break ran from 12:45 to 2 o'clock. Cole didn't eat. He had a glass of water and stood near a window with Gerald and didn't talk much because Gerald understood that talking wasn't always helpful. And there were times when the most useful thing one person could do for another was be present without filling the space. Patricia Huang found them at 1:30. She'd been in the room all morning, but Cole had only caught glimpses of her. She moved through crowds with the efficiency of someone accustomed to conference environments, picking up information on the way. "The phone lines have been busy during the break," she said, by way of greeting. "I overheard one of the station operators, the Geneva Museum's representative, called twice." "Twice," Gerald repeated. "They're serious. And the Texas Foundation, they have a direct line to the auctioneer's office. That's not standard." Cole looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means they pre-cleared a bidding ceiling that might be outside normal increment protocols. It's unusual. It's not something I've seen often." She looked at him steadily. "The room wants this car, Cole. The question is how badly." He nodded. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Fine." She gave him the look that said she knew fine was not an answer, but was choosing to accept it anyway. "Okay, I'll be in the back left, near the main screens." She went. Cole drank his water. Gerald said nothing. At 1:58, Cole's phone buzzed. A text from Tommy, who was sitting with Maya. "She's not nervous at all. How is that possible?" "I'm nervous." Cole almost smiled. The second session opened at 2 o'clock precisely. The lots before Lot 112 were strong. A significant American muscle car, a coach-built Italian convertible, a matched pair of British sports cars consigned by an estate. The room gave each of them proper attention. Cole watched from his seat and kept his breathing even and his hands still in his lap. He'd noticed sometime in the first session that he had a tendency to grip his knee when bidding got competitive, a self-calming gesture that he was trying to suppress because he didn't want whatever he was feeling to be visible. Maya put her hand over his on his knee at one point, without looking at him, and held it there for about 30 seconds. He let her. Then she moved her hand back to her own lap, still without looking at him, and they both pretended it hadn't happened. Lot 112. The auctioneer, a man named Caldwell, 60s, silver-haired, with the voice of someone who'd done this long enough that every syllable was exactly where he intended it to be, paused for a moment as the screens changed. "Lot 112, he said. "Ladies and gentlemen, an extraordinary opportunity. A 1968 factory-built racing prototype, authenticated by Gerald Forsyth and Dr. Patricia Huang, carrying a provenance that represents one of the most significant rediscoveries in the history of this auction house." He let that sit for a moment. The room had gone quiet in a way that was different from the polite quiet of an audience waiting for a performance. This was the quiet of actual attention. "The car is presented in as-found condition, consistent with the authentication documentation submitted to the Harrington. We will open bidding at $800,000. Cole heard Maya inhale sharply beside him. 800,000. The catalog estimate had said 2 to 3 million, and they were opening at 800,000, which was a deliberate choice, low enough to guarantee immediate participation from multiple bidders, high enough to signal that the floor was serious. 3 paddles went up simultaneously before Caldwell had fully finished the sentence. The phone station along the left wall activated immediately. From somewhere in the back, a digital bidding indicator lit up on the room's main screen. 800,000, thank you. Do I have 9? The room moved. Cole had watched plenty of auctions, and he'd never seen one move the way this one did in the first 90 seconds. Not the slow building of early momentum that most bidding wars required, but an immediate compressed energy, like the first drop of a roller coaster, everyone dropping into it at once. 900. A million. 1, 2, 1, 5. At 1.5 million, 2 paddles dropped out. The phone station on the left was still active. The digital bidding indicator was still active. 2 paddles in the room, one near the front, one on the right side, neither of which Cole could see clearly from his position, were still moving. $2 million, Caldwell said, with the composed pleasure of a man watching something go exactly right. Do I have 2-1? 2-1 came from the phone station. Cole glanced at the phone station and saw Natalie's assistant. She was speaking quietly into her headset, making eye contact with the woman in the third row, who gave a small nod. Natalie was bidding. Cole looked back at the front of the room. 2-1 from the phone station, 2-2 from the floor, thank you. 2-3? 2-3 came from the right side of the room. The digital indicator on the main screen ticked upward. 2-4. 2-5. At 2.5 million, a third paddle dropped out. Cole counted the active parties, the phone station, Natalie, The right side floor bidder, the digital channel. 3 active. 26, 27, 28. The increments were holding at 100,000 per step, which was the standard for this range. Cole knew that above 3 million, the Harrington typically moved to 200,000 increments. They'd reach that point soon. $3 million. The room made a sound, not loud, not dramatic, a collective exhale, a release of held breath, the recognition that the number had moved beyond the conservative estimate into territory that meant something different. Cole felt it in his own chest, the sound of a room understanding that what they were watching was real. Maya's hand found his knee again. He put his hand over hers this time. Neither of them looked at the other. 3-2 from the digital channel. 3-4 from the floor. Caldwell's voice was unhurried. 3-6? Yes. 3-6 from the phone station. Thank you. 3-6 was Natalie. Cole watched the assistant at the station make another eye contact check with the third row. The nod from Natalie was the same as before. Precise, minimal, the nod of someone who'd decided where this was going. The right side floor bidder dropped at 3-6. Digital channel came in at 3-8. Phone station at $4 million. The room was almost completely silent except for the auctioneer's voice and the muted sounds of the phone station operators. Cole could feel his heartbeat with unusual clarity. He kept his breathing steady by force of will and tried to watch the room the way his father had taught him to watch things. Without the emotional noise, just the information. 2 bidders now, Natalie's phone station and the digital channel. 4-2 from the digital channel, 4-4 from the phone station. Caldwell paused for exactly the right length of time. 4-6? The digital channel hesitated. On the main screen, the indicator stayed still for 4 seconds. 4 seconds that felt, in the silence of the room, considerably longer. Then it moved. 4-6. 4-6, 4-8? Natalie's assistant leaned into her headset. A longer pause this time. The third row consultation lasted 2 seconds instead of 1. The nod. 4-8? 5 million? Cole heard someone behind him. A woman, older, one of the museum representatives maybe, whisper something in German. He didn't speak German, but he understood the tone. $5 million came from the digital channel. Cole thought, that's Texas. The Texas Foundation, the one Patricia had mentioned, the one that had pre-cleared a ceiling outside normal increment protocols. They were going to keep going. 5 million. 5-2? Phone station. Natalie. 5-4? Digital. Texas. 5-6? A longer pause. The phone station operator was speaking quietly, efficiently. The look to Natalie was held a fraction longer than previous ones. Natalie's face was in profile from where Cole sat. He could see the line of her jaw, the stillness of her expression, the way she was holding herself with a composure that cost something, because composure at these numbers always costs something. She nodded. 5-6 from the phone station, 5-8 from the digital channel. Here the digital channel did something unexpected. The indicator on the main screen jumped not to 5-8 but to 6-2. A skip bid, an aggressive move designed to signal strength and potentially shock the other bidder into reassessing. The room absorbed this. Caldwell adapted without missing a beat. 6-2 from the digital channel. The bid is 6-2. He looked toward the phone station. Do I have 6-4? The phone station operator looked at Natalie. The look lasted 3 full seconds. Cole counted. Natalie's profile was still, jaw set, and then something moved in her expression. Not a crack exactly, but a shift. A small internal recalibration visible from the outside only if you were watching very carefully. She nodded. 6-4 from the phone station. 6-6? The digital channel came back at 6-6. 7 seconds of indicator stillness before it moved. They were feeling the pressure now. 6-6? 6-8? Phone station. Natalie. 6-8. 7 million? The digital channel was still. 8 seconds. 10. Caldwell let it breathe. $7 million from the phone station. The bid is 7 million. Do I have 7-2? The digital channel indicator did not move. 14 seconds. Cole was counting. $7 million. Going once. The room was absolutely still. Even the ambient sounds, the ventilation system, the distant traffic outside, the small, settling sounds of a large building seemed to stop. Going twice. Maya's hand tightened on his. Cole looked at the green car. It sat on its platform under the gallery lights, unrestored and unimproved and completely itself. And he thought about the first time he'd crouched beside it, in the back corner of the Meridian Convention Center, with his phone flashlight at a low angle, and felt the thing he'd learned to trust. He thought about his father's voice saying, "The education's free." He thought about Rachel, who had never seen this car but who had known, somehow, in the particular way she'd known things, that Cole's instincts were worth betting on. "Sold," Caldwell said, "at $7 million to the phone station." The gavel came down. The room came up. Not a standing ovation in the formal sense. These weren't the kind of people who did standing ovations. But the applause was real and immediate and sustained, and people were standing, and the sound of it was different from the polite acknowledgement that had greeted the other lots. This was recognition. The room recognizing that something had happened today that was going to be talked about for a while. Cole sat still. Maya let go of his hand and turned to look at him, and her face was doing something he'd never seen it do before. Not crying. Maya didn't cry easily, but close to it, the specific expression of someone who was feeling something too large for their face to hold all at once. "Dad," she said. He couldn't say anything for a moment. "Dad," she said again. "I know," he said. $7 million. "I know." "You paid 7,000. "I know, Maya." She looked at him for another moment. Then, because she was exactly who she was, she said, "You need to stand up. People are looking at you." He stood up. Gerald was there almost immediately, gripping his hand in both of his, saying something that Cole could hear but couldn't quite process, because the sound of the room was still going and his own internal sound was going louder. Patricia was there 30 seconds later, her expression the contained delight of a scholar watching theory become fact. Tommy got to him last, pushing through the small crowd that had formed with a face that was entirely without composure, which was somehow the most moving thing Cole had seen all day. "7 million, Tommy said. 7 million, Cole agreed. Tommy grabbed him in a hug that lasted longer than it probably should have, in a room full of people who didn't know either of them. Cole let it happen. He stood in the middle of the Harrington International Auction Hall with Tommy's arms around him and the applause still going, and $7 million settling into the world like a fact. And he looked over Tommy's shoulder at Maya, who was standing 2 feet away watching her father with the quiet pride of someone who'd believed from the beginning and was now watching the evidence catch up to the belief. She caught his eye. She gave him a small nod. He gave her one back. The crowd thinned over the following hour as the auction moved to its final lots. Cole went through the necessary procedural steps with the Harrington staff. The confirmation of sale, the documentation, the preliminary financial arrangements, with a focus he was surprised to find he still had. There was a lot to process, and not all of it was going to be processed today. He knew that about himself. The real weight of things usually landed on him later, quietly, when the room was empty and the event was over. Today was still the event. The Harrington's director of acquisitions, Andrew Calloway, found him near the documentation desk and shook his hand with the warmth of someone who genuinely understood what they'd just been part of. "I want you to know," Calloway said, "that in 22 years with this organization, I've rarely seen a floor respond like that to an unrestored vehicle." "The car earned it," Cole said. "Yes, it did." Calloway looked at him carefully. "And so did the man who found it." He moved on because he had other things to attend to, and Cole stood at the documentation desk with a pen in his hand and a form in front of him and thought about unrestored vehicles and the people who found them. Maya came to stand beside him while he filled out the form. "What happens now?" she asked. "A lot of paperwork. Transfer of title, funds processed through the Harrington's escrow, which takes a few business days. There are fees and commissions to account for." He kept writing. "Net of all that, we're looking at somewhere around 6.3, maybe 6.4 million. Maya was quiet while she did the math. He could feel her doing it. "That's a lot of figuring out," she said finally. "It is." "Are you going to be okay at that? The financial part?" He glanced at her. She was asking seriously, not rhetorically. asking whether he, specifically Cole Bennett, who had spent the past decade managing a shop lease and a credit card balance and a mortgage, was equipped to handle a number with that many digits. It was a fair question. It was possibly the most sensible question anyone had asked him all day. "I'm going to get help," he said. "A financial advisor, someone who knows how this works." "Good," she said, "because I don't think you should try to manage $6 million on your own. That's probably wise." "It is wise." She watched him sign the form. "Can we get dinner? Real dinner, not the hotel." He looked at her, the blue dress, the old winter coat with the sleeves riding up her wrists, the expression of a child who had been very composed for a very long time today and who was now running low on it. "Yeah," he said. "Real dinner. Whatever you want." "Pasta," she said immediately. "The good kind, not from a box." "Done." He finished the form and handed it back to the desk, and was turning to go when he felt the specific quality of someone stopping nearby. He recognized the feeling from the night before, and he knew before he looked. Natalie Ashcroft was standing at a distance that was close enough to be intentional, but far enough to be deniable. She had a glass of water again. He wondered if that was always her auction room drink, water instead of wine, the choice of someone who wanted her mind clear when numbers were moving. Her assistant was not with her this time. She was looking at him with an expression he recognized now, having seen it twice before, but which was clearer this time than it had been at the buffet table, less guarded. Something had shifted in the hours since the gavel had come down. Something about what you're allowed to feel about someone when the numbers have spoken and the argument is over. Maya had seen her too. Cole felt his daughter go very still beside him with the particular stillness that meant she was making a decision about how to behave. He looked at Natalie. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Maya, in a voice that was entirely polite and entirely direct, said, "You were the one at the other auction, the one who said it was garbage." Cole closed his eyes briefly. Natalie looked at Maya, really looked at her, the way she looked at things when she was actually looking, and something crossed her face that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "Yes," Natalie said. "That was me." Maya considered this for a moment, with the gravity of someone weighing a verdict. "My dad knew it wasn't," she said, "from the beginning." "I know that now." Natalie held Maya's gaze, which was harder than it looked, because Maya had a way of looking at people that made them feel assessed. "I didn't look carefully enough. That was a mistake." Maya seemed to think about this for another moment. Then, with the particular generosity of someone who'd decided not to hold a thing longer than it deserved, "Okay," she said. "Just okay. Nothing more." She looked at Cole with an expression that said, "Your turn," and then looked back out at the room, giving them whatever privacy a 10-year-old standing 2 feet away could plausibly provide. Cole looked at Natalie. She looked at him. The room moved around them, people departing, staff clearing, the last lots wrapping up somewhere beyond the main floor. "You were serious," he said. Not a question. "The bidding." "I was serious," she said. "Why? You could have let Texas take it. You knew you were going to lose at some point." She thought about this, the kind of thinking that meant she was going to give him a real answer instead of a managed one. "The car deserved to be fought for," she said finally. "After what I said." A pause. "And I don't like losing things I decide I want, even when I lose them." Was it about the car or about being wrong? She didn't flinch. "Both," she said. "That's an honest answer." "Yeah," he said. "It is." A silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised him slightly. "I'd like to talk," she said. "Not today, when things are settled and you've had time to breathe. I have some thoughts about what comes next. Not an investment pitch, nothing like that. Just—" She stopped, started again. "You have a way of seeing things, Mr. Bennett. That's not common, and I think it would be worth a conversation." He looked at her for a long moment. He was a mechanic from Claremont with grease under his fingernails and a daughter who needed a winter coat and a bank account that was about to have $6 million in it, and she was Natalie Ashcroft, who'd been on the cover of magazines and who had said scrapyard 4 seconds after looking at the most valuable thing he'd ever found. He thought about what Gerald had said months ago, in the shop. The education's free. "I'll think about it," he said. Not yes, not no. Something that left the door at whatever width he decided it should be. She nodded. She seemed to accept this as the fair answer it was. Congratulations, she said. On everything today. The car was extraordinary. She looked at Maya briefly. And it sounds like the conviction was, too. She walked away. Cole watched her go for a moment and then looked at Maya, who had been listening to every word while appearing to look at the ceiling. She's not that bad, Maya said. She bid against us for $3 million. And lost, Maya said, which took guts, spending that much to lose on purpose. She looked at him. Right? He thought about it. Yeah, he said. Actually, yeah. Can we go eat now? Yeah, he said. We can go eat. He put his hand on Maya's shoulder and she didn't shrug it off, which she sometimes did when she was performing Independence. And they walked together toward the exit, through the thinning crowd of the Harrington International, past the platforms where the sold cars sat waiting for their new chapters, past the staff who were already beginning the work of closing down, past the corner of the room where the green car, lot 112, $7 million, once a dusty, forgotten machine in the back of a room where nobody was looking, sat under its gallery lights for the last time as Cole's. He didn't stop to look at it again. He'd looked at it enough. He knew what it was. He'd always known. Outside, the evening air was cold, and the city was lit up, and Maya walked beside him with her old coat and her blue dress and her 2 long sleeves, and Tommy was waiting by the truck across the street with his hands in his pockets and his breath showing in the cold. Dinner? Tommy called. Pasta, Maya called back. The good kind. I know a place, Tommy said. They crossed the street in the cold November evening, 3 people from Claremont who'd driven 2 hours for a number that was going to take the rest of their lives to fully understand, and somewhere behind them in the convention center, the gavel was coming down on the final lot of the day, and the Harrington International auction was ending, and one specific chapter of the story Cole Bennett had started in the back corner of the Meridian Convention Center with a phone flashlight and a feeling he'd learned to trust was closing quietly behind him as he walked away from it. The pasta was good, not transcendent, not life-changing, just genuinely good. A place Tommy knew 3 blocks from the hotel, red checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles, and a menu that hadn't changed in 20 years because it didn't need to. Maya had the carbonara. Tommy had the lasagna. Cole ordered something and then spent most of the meal moving it around his plate, which Maya noticed and didn't comment on, which was its own kind of comment. The conversation was mostly Tommy's. He talked about the auction, about the bidding, about the moment the gavel came down, filling the air with the energy of someone who'd been holding it in for hours and now had a place to put it. Cole listened and nodded and contributed enough to keep it going, and Maya ate her carbonara with focused attention and occasional observations that were more precise than Tommy's but less frequent. And for an hour in a restaurant with red checkered tablecloths, the 3 of them were just people who'd had a remarkable day and were trying to figure out how to sit inside it. Cole paid the check. Tommy argued about it for 45 seconds, and then let him, because some arguments were performances, and both parties understood that. On the drive back to the hotel, Tommy driving, Maya in the back seat, Cole in the passenger seat with the window cracked despite the cold because he needed the air, Maya fell asleep somewhere around the 40-minute mark, her head tilted against the window, the old coat pulled up around her shoulders. Tommy drove without talking. The road was mostly empty at that hour, dark fields on both sides, the occasional cluster of lights from a gas station or an overpass. You doing okay? Tommy said finally, quietly, so as not to wake Maya. Yeah. Real answer. Cole looked out the window. I don't know what I am yet. I think I need a few days before I know. Tommy nodded. Fair. The numbers are... He stopped. I've been managing tight my whole adult life. Not poor, not struggling exactly, but tight. Everything planned, everything accounted for, and now there's a number that doesn't... He stopped again. It doesn't fit in my head yet, like the container is the wrong size. Give it time. Yeah. What's the first thing you're going to do, practically? Cole had been thinking about this for most of the dinner, which was why he hadn't been eating. Pay off the mortgage, completely. then the credit card. Then I want to talk to a financial person before I do anything else big. Gerald gave me a name, someone who works with people who come into larger sums unexpectedly. He says she's good and that she'll tell me the truth instead of what I want to hear. Smart. After that, he paused. I want to do something with the shop, not just keep doing what I've been doing, something more. Tommy glanced at him. More how? I've been thinking about it for months, since the car, since the authentication, since those kids started coming by on weekends. He looked at his hands, which were in his lap. Diego and Carla and Sam. They're good. Carla especially. She taught herself from forums, Tommy, and she understands things that mechanics twice her age don't. Sam is 17 and he has an eye that I'd have killed for at his age. And Diego is... He shook his head. He's doing oil changes because nobody gave him a real chance. And you want to give them a real chance. I want to build a place where that's the whole point. Not just, he thought about how to say it, not just taking in broken cars and fixing them. Taking in forgotten things and finding out what they actually are. Cars that people have written off. Mechanics that people have written off. Making it a real operation, proper space, proper equipment, a mentorship structure that actually works. He paused. There's a building on the east side of Claremont. Commercial zoning, good square footage, decent bones. The roof needs work and the electrical is probably a mess, but the space itself is... You've been looking at buildings. For about 3 weeks. Tommy was quiet for a moment. You were that sure it was going to work. No, Cole said. I was sure enough to start thinking, there's a difference. Tommy drove. The lights of Claremont were beginning to appear on the horizon, the soft glow of a mid-sized city at night. I'll help, Tommy said. Whatever you need. Equipment, transport, logistics, whatever. I know you will. I'm not saying it to be nice. I'm saying it because I want to be part of it. Cole looked at him. Tommy kept his eyes on the road, jaw set, the expression of a man who meant what he'd said and didn't need it acknowledged to know he'd meant it. Okay, Cole said. Okay. They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and Maya slept in the back seat, and the city lights grew until they were inside them. The first week after the auction was administrative in a way that Cole hadn't fully anticipated. The Harringtons' process was thorough. Documentation, transfer confirmations, fee accounting. And by the time everything cleared and the net amount landed in the account Cole had opened specifically for this purpose, a week had passed and the number had still not entirely fit inside his head. $6.3 million. After the Harringtons' buyer's premium and the seller's commission and the incidental costs of the authentication process. $6.3 million in an account with his name on it. He stared at the balance on his phone screen for longer than was probably healthy, standing in his kitchen on a Tuesday morning, and then he put the phone face down and made coffee and sent an email to the financial advisor Gerald had recommended, a woman named Helen Marsh, whose website was clean and whose client testimonials were unflashy in a way that Cole found reassuring. Helen Marsh replied within 2 hours, and they spoke on the phone that afternoon. She asked him questions for 45 minutes and answered his questions for another 30, and at the end of the call she said, "You have a clear idea of what you want and a realistic understanding of what you don't know. That's actually less common than you'd think." Is that good or bad? It's good. Most people I talk to after a windfall either know everything or know nothing. Both are problems in different ways. You're in the middle, which is where I can actually help. He liked her immediately, which made him slightly cautious about liking her. And then he decided the caution was excessive and scheduled a proper in-person meeting. He paid off the mortgage on the morning of the day the funds fully cleared, from his kitchen table, on his laptop, with Maya at school and the house quiet around him. The transaction took 4 minutes. He closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the kitchen where he'd drunk bad coffee and stayed up too late running numbers for years, and tried to feel the weight of what had just changed. He felt it. It wasn't dramatic. It was quieter than he'd expected, the specific relief of something that had been pressing on him for so long he'd stopped feeling it as pressure, releasing all at once, the absence of a thing rather than the presence of something new. He thought about Rachel. He did that sometimes in the quiet moments, not with grief exactly, not anymore, but with the specific wish that she could have seen certain things. She would have liked this one. She would have said something dry and accurate about it, and then hugged him, and he would have felt it properly in a way he could never quite feel things alone. He opened the laptop again and sent the email to the Claremont building owner. Natalie Ashcroft called on a Thursday, 9 days after the auction, at 11 in the morning. Cole was in the shop, an actual shop job, a clutch replacement on a customer's truck, back to regular work the week after because regular work was what kept the wheels on. And he almost didn't answer because his hands were not clean and his phone was on the workbench, and he had another hour before he'd be at a good stopping point. He answered anyway, some instinct. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "is this a bad time? I'm mid-job. Give me 20 minutes. I'll call back." She called back in 22 minutes while he was washing his hands at the sink. He answered on the first ring this time. "I want to have a proper conversation," she said. "I said that at the Harrington and I meant it. I thought I'd follow up before the window closed." "What window?" "The one where you're still deciding whether to take my call." A pause. "You have options now, Mr. Bennett. You don't need to talk to anyone you don't want to talk to. I thought I'd get in before that became fully apparent to you." It was such a direct statement that for a moment he wasn't sure how to respond to it. He dried his hands and leaned against the workbench. "What do you want to talk about?" he said. "What you're going to do next," she said. "I've been thinking about it since the auction. What you said about the car, but about leaving it unrestored, about letting the truth speak for itself. And what you said to me at the buffet table." A pause. "About looking." "I don't think I said much at the buffet table." "You said enough." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm in Chicago this week. I could come to Claremont next week if that works. No agenda, no pitch, just a conversation. You can end it whenever you want." Cole thought about it. He'd told her, "I'll think about it at the Harrington," which had been an honest answer at the time, and he'd thought about it intermittently in the 9 days since, alongside the mortgage payoff and the financial advisor calls and the building inquiry and Sam showing up on Saturday morning exactly on time, as he always did now. "Tuesday," he said. "Afternoon. Come to the shop." A pause. "The shop. That's where I work." "Yes," she said. "Tuesday afternoon. The shop." Another pause, shorter. "Thank you." She came on Tuesday at 2 o'clock, on time, in a car that was not the kind of car that usually appeared in Cole's shop parking lot. She'd brought no assistant. She was wearing clothes that were clearly expensive but not formal. She'd made a choice about the register of the visit, Cole noticed, and she'd gotten it about right. She stood in the shop doorway for a moment, taking in the space, the 2 bays, the equipment, the half-finished job on the lift, the corner where the green car had lived for months before the Harrington. Then she came in and extended her hand, and he shook it, and he was aware that his hands were mostly clean but not perfectly clean, and he did not apologize for that. "Thank you for coming here," she said, looking around. "I mean that. It's a more honest conversation in your space than mine." "That's why I said the shop." "I know." He pulled 2 shop stools from the corner and they sat, which was not how Cole usually conducted anything resembling a professional meeting, but it felt right for this, and he was going on instinct, which he'd decided weeks ago to stop second-guessing. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said, "about what comes next, and I'll tell you what I'm thinking, and we can see if any of it overlaps." So he told her. Not the whole thing, not the way he'd told Tommy in the truck, which had been raw and incomplete, but the structured version he'd been building in his head since the auction. The building on the east side of Claremont, the model he was thinking about, a restoration workshop that specialized specifically in cars that had been overlooked or misidentified, the ones with hidden histories, the ones that needed the kind of careful, patient attention that most commercial operations couldn't afford to give, paired with a real mentorship program, not informal weekend visits but an actual structure, paid apprenticeships, a curriculum built from his father's knowledge and his own, and whatever else he could find and adapt. He told her about Diego and Carla and Sam. He told her about why Carla's binder had embarrassed him slightly, because it was better documented than most professional operations he'd seen. He told her about Sam's eye, the specific quality of observation in a 17-year-old who'd showed up without calling because he wanted to learn how to really look at cars. Natalie listened with the quality of attention he'd started to recognize as specific to her, not just patient, but active. She was doing something while she listened, processing, cross-referencing, building. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The mentorship piece, she said, that's not an add-on for you, that's core. Yeah. Why? He thought about how to answer honestly. Because I got the knowledge I have from my father. He gave it to me because he had it to give, and I was in front of him. If he hadn't been there, he paused. Diego is good, Natalie. He should not be doing oil changes at a chain shop. That's not his ceiling. That's a failure of access. And Carla taught herself from the internet because nobody with real knowledge was in her path. He stopped. That bothers me. It bothered me before the auction, and it bothers me more now that I have options. She looked at him. The look lasted long enough that he was briefly aware of it as a look rather than just a conversational beat. Okay, she said. Now I'll tell you what I'm thinking. She'd been doing research, she said, since the auction. Not about coal specifically, but about the broader ecosystem. The market for properly authenticated forgotten vehicles was underserved at the discovery and early documentation stage. Most of the infrastructure existed downstream: restorers, auction houses, collectors, museums. But the process of finding and correctly identifying overlooked vehicles, the actual skill Cole had applied at the Meridian, was largely informal, dependent on individuals with specialized knowledge who operated without institutional support. There are maybe 30 people in the country who can do what you did at the Meridian, she said. Find it, identify it, authenticate it, bring it through properly, and none of them are running operations designed to scale that capability. I'm not sure it scales, Cole said. The methodology might not scale exactly, but the training might. She looked at him steadily. If you can teach someone to look the way you look, to understand what they're actually seeing rather than what they expect to see, that's replicable. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. He thought about his father. The pile gets big enough and you're not wrong anymore. What are you proposing? He said. I'm not proposing anything yet. I told you, no pitch. I'm telling you what I see. She leaned back slightly on the stool. But if at some point in the future you wanted a partner who could provide capital, operational expertise, and access to networks you don't currently have, and if that partner could learn, over time, to bring something to the work besides money, she paused. That's a conversation worth having. A partner who learns to look, Cole said. A partner who already failed to look once, in public, in front of a room full of people, and who would prefer not to make that particular mistake again. It was the most direct thing she'd said about the Meridian, and she'd said it without any protective varnish, and he gave her credit for that. You understand, he said, that what I do isn't glamorous most of the time. It's not one extraordinary find at an auction. It's months of regular work, bad leads, vehicles that turn out to be exactly what they look like. It's standing in dusty barns and poorly lit storage units and asking owners questions they find annoying. Yes, she said, and the mentorship piece, that's not a PR initiative. It's a real program with real kids who have real needs and who sometimes don't show up and sometimes show up twice and need things I'm not trained to provide. I understand. I'm saying this because I want to make sure you understand what you'd actually be involved in, if we ever had that conversation. I understand, Mr. Bennett. Her voice was patient. I'm not looking for a feature in a magazine. I'm looking for something worth taking seriously. A pause. I've had enough things that photograph well. They sat with that for a moment. Call me Cole, he said finally. Something shifted in her expression. Not a full smile. She didn't seem to do full smiles easily, which he was starting to think was simply how she was built rather than guardedness, but the territory adjacent to one. Natalie, she said. He nodded. I'll think about the conversation. That seems to be your answer for things you're not ready to decide. It's an honest answer. It is, she said. I respect honest answers. She stood from the stool. Can I ask you something before I go? Sure. The Meridian. When you were looking at the car and I walked past and said what I said, she stopped, started again. Did you know, in that moment, what I'd gotten wrong about how I'd looked at it? Cole considered this. He could see the parking lot through the open bay door, her car sitting in the November light. I knew you hadn't looked at it long enough, he said. I didn't know anything about you specifically, just that you'd given it 4 seconds and moved on. And that was enough to know it was a mistake. 4 seconds is enough to form an impression, he said. It's not enough to know something. She was quiet for a moment. My father collected cars, she said. He taught me what to look at. The obvious things, the markers, the signals that most collectors use. I got good at reading those signals quickly. A pause. I think I stopped being curious. The signals were enough. Yeah, Cole said. That happens. It happened to me at the worst possible moment, apparently. She picked up her coat from where she'd laid it over the second stool. For what it's worth, I won't make that mistake again, in any context. I believe you, he said. And he did. Not because it was the thing to say, but because he'd watched her over the course of 2 encounters now, and she had the quality, specific and rare, of someone who was genuinely capable of updating. Most people found being wrong intolerable. She seemed to find it instructive. She left. He watched the car pull out of the lot and then stood in the shop doorway for a while with the cold air coming in. Tommy appeared from the direction of the office, where he'd been conspicuously present the entire time. I wasn't listening, Tommy said. You were absolutely listening. Maybe a little. He came to stand beside Cole in the doorway. Well? She's serious. About what? About... Cole thought about how to describe it. About understanding what she missed, and about not wanting to keep being someone who misses things. He looked at the parking lot. People usually either don't know they missed something, or they know and they decide it's the car's fault. She's doing neither. Is that a good sign? I think so. He turned back into the shop. For whatever comes next. Whatever came next arrived in pieces over the following weeks, not as a single decision, but as a series of smaller ones that accumulated into a direction. The building on the east side of Claremont, it turned out, had more problems than just the roof and the electrical. There was a foundation issue on the northeast corner that the inspector found and that revised the acquisition price downward significantly, which Cole negotiated with the patience of a man who'd learned to wait for the real number rather than the first one. He got the building at a price that worked. He told Helen Marsh about it in their third meeting. She looked at the numbers he'd put together and said, "The structural repair is expensive, but not prohibitive. The build-out cost for the workshop space is reasonable if you're doing phased development." She looked at him over her glasses. "You've done preliminary work on this." "Some. More than some." She made a note. "What's the revenue model in year 1? "Commercial restoration. We take on projects the same way I do now, but with better capacity and equipment. That's the baseline. The mentorship program is grant eligible in some categories, and I'm going to look at what's available. And," he paused, "there may be a partnership coming, nothing formal yet. But if it materializes, the capital structure looks different." "Ashcroft?" Helen said. He looked at her. "How did you—" "Gerald Forsyth mentioned she attended the auction, and that she spoke to you afterward." Helen's expression was professionally neutral. "If she's involved, the capital isn't the complicated part. The complicated part is the governance. You need to understand very clearly what she controls and what you control before any money moves." "I know." "Do you have a lawyer?" "Not yet." "Get one. Before the partnership conversation goes further." She put her pen down. "I mean it, Cole. She's very good at deals. That doesn't mean she'll take advantage of you. I'm not saying that. I'm saying she will expect you to show up knowing what you're signing, and you should." He got a lawyer. A woman named Patricia, not Dr. Huang, a different Patricia, a business attorney in Claremont who came recommended by Helen and who had a directness that Cole appreciated and a fee structure that made him wince slightly, which he acknowledged without apology. "Good lawyers are expensive," she said at their first meeting. "Bad ones are more expensive. You're about to enter a significant business relationship. Don't cut this corner." He didn't cut the corner. The formal conversation with Natalie happened 6 weeks after the Tuesday shop visit, in a conference room at a law office in the city. Both sides had lawyers. The documents were long, and the negotiation took 3 meetings to complete. And there were moments in the second meeting when Cole sat across the table from Natalie and their lawyers, and felt the specific discomfort of two people who'd established something like personal respect now conducting business, which was a different kind of interaction and not always a comfortable one. The moment that mattered most came at the end of the second meeting, when the lawyers were gathering their papers and Cole and Natalie were left at the table with the draft agreement between them and a question that the lawyers couldn't answer for them. Creative control, Cole said. The decisions about which vehicles we take on, the decisions about who enters the apprenticeship program, those have to stay with me. They do, Natalie said. That's not a negotiating position. That's a condition. I know. I agreed to it in the third page of the draft. She looked at him. I'm not going to second-guess your eye, Cole. That would rather defeat the purpose. And the mentorship program, the structure, the curriculum, the students, that's mine. Also agreed. She folded her hands on the table. What I'm providing is capital, network access, and business infrastructure. What you're providing is the knowledge and the judgment. If I start overriding the judgment, the whole thing loses its value. She paused. I understand that. I'm not going to pretend I learned that lesson easily, but I learned it. He believed her. He signed on the third meeting. The day after the agreements were signed, Cole drove to the East Side building and stood in the empty main space with the afternoon light coming through the high industrial windows and the smell of dust and old concrete around him, and thought about what his father would have said. Frank Bennett had never had 60 square feet of unencumbered workspace, let alone 6,000. He'd run his operation out of a building he rented month to month for 27 years, one bay at a time, never quite saving enough to own it, never quite getting the expansion he'd planned. He died in a building that was not his, and Cole had always carried that quietly, the specific weight of something he hadn't been able to fix before the time ran out. He stood in the empty space for a long time. Then he called Diego. I need to talk to you, he said. Is everything okay? Everything's fine. I have something to offer you, and I want to do it in person. He paused. Can you come by the shop Saturday? I'll be there at 8, Diego said, with the immediacy of someone who didn't need to check a schedule because his schedule currently contained nothing he'd rather do. He called Carla. Same conversation, different voice. Carla asked 3 precise clarifying questions before saying yes, which was very Carla, and which Cole had been expecting and had prepared answers for. Sam he told in person on Friday afternoon, when the kid came by after school the way he'd been doing every Friday for 2 months. Sam was leaning over an engine bay when Cole said, I'm opening a new space, proper workshop. I want you in it. Sam stood up straight. He was 17, lanky, with hands that were already developing the specific competence of someone who worked with them regularly. His expression went through several things quickly. Like, working, he said. Paid apprenticeship. Real structure. You'd have to stay in school. That's not optional. But the hours outside school are yours to give if you want to give them. Sam looked at him for a long moment. Why me? Because you showed up without calling, because you wanted to learn how to really look at cars, Cole said. And then you did. You actually learned. He looked at the kid. That's rarer than you think. Sam turned back to the engine bay. He was quiet for about 30 seconds. Then, I'm in. Good. Saturday morning, 8 o'clock. I'll be there at 7:45. 8 is fine, Sam. 7:45, Sam said, with the stubbornness of a teenager who'd decided something, and Cole let it go. The Saturday meeting in the shop had a quality Cole hadn't anticipated. It felt right in a way that wasn't about the money or the building or the signed agreements, but about what was actually in the room. Diego, who'd driven 45 minutes and was wearing his cleanest shirt. Carla, who'd brought the binder, the same binder from the first visit, updated and expanded, which Cole noticed and didn't comment on yet. Sam, who had arrived at 7:42 and had been visibly trying to be casual about it ever since. Cole stood at the front of his shop, his actual shop, the one with the month-to-month lease and the 2 bays and the regular customers, and told them what was coming. The building, the workshop model, the apprenticeship structure, the partnership, the scope of what he was trying to build. He didn't dress it up. He told them what it was and what it wasn't, that it was going to be hard work, and that hard work wasn't always interesting, and that there would be periods of frustration, that he was learning as he went on the business side and that he was going to make mistakes, that the mentorship structure was real and that his expectations were real, and that he was offering them something genuine rather than something comfortable. When he finished, the shop was quiet. Diego spoke first. "You really believe it can work?" "Yeah," Cole said. "I do." "Because of the car?" "Because of what the car showed me about what's possible when you look at something properly." He looked at Diego. "You're part of that. You're what's possible when someone actually looks." Diego nodded. He was holding his coffee cup in both hands and looking at the floor with the expression of a man absorbing something he wasn't sure he'd expected to be offered. Carla said, "The curriculum. Do you have it written out yet?" "No, I want to build it with you, not for you." She looked up. "Oh," she said. Then, "Good." Sam said nothing, which with Sam meant he was already in and had been since 7:42. Tommy, who'd been sitting in the office doorway with a coffee and had not been invited but was there anyway, said, "Somebody should write this down, the beginning of it, so later people know how it started." "It started with a dusty green car in a back corner," Cole said. "It started before that," Tommy said. "It started with a guy who showed up and looked when everyone else walked past." Cole didn't respond to that. He picked up his coffee and drank it and looked at the three people in his shop, Diego and Carla and Sam, and thought about his father and about the building on the east side with its foundation issue and its high industrial windows, and about a 10-year-old girl who was going to need a winter coat before the month was out, and about the particular weight of things you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten they were weight. He'd gotten Maya the coat the week after the auction cleared. She'd tried it on in the store, assessed herself in the mirror with the critical attention she applied to most things, and said, "It's good, but I would have been fine with the old one." "I know," he said. "I'm not complaining. I know that too." She'd looked at him in the mirror, the new coat on, the store lights bright around them. "It feels different," she said. "Not the coat, the—" She'd gestured vaguely, meaning the larger thing. "Everything." "Yeah," he said. "It does. Is that okay?" He'd thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "Different doesn't mean wrong." She'd turned back to the mirror and looked at herself for another moment. Then she'd said, with the particular matter-of-fact confidence that was entirely her own, "Okay, I'll take the coat." Standing in the shop now with his coffee and his 3 future apprentices and Tommy in the doorway, Cole thought about that moment in the store. About the word different in a child's mouth, trying to describe something too large for a single word. About how the coat had looked on her. The right size, finally. Room to grow into. That was the whole thing, really. Room to grow into. He'd spent 32 years in spaces that were exactly the right size for exactly what he was. Nothing extra, nothing left over. And now there was room. He was still figuring out what to do with it. That was honest. He was going to make mistakes on the business side, he'd told them, and he meant it. The partnership with Natalie was solid on paper and promising in practice, and still carried the normal uncertainty of 2 people from different worlds deciding to trust each other with something real. The building on the east side was going to eat money before it made any. The apprenticeship program was going to be harder to run than it looked on paper, because people were harder to run than programs, and Diego and Carla and Sam were people with their own complications and their own histories and their own particular ways of being wrong about things. He was going to figure it out. He always figured it out. But this time, figuring it out didn't mean just staying afloat. It meant building something. Something with a foundation that actually held. Something his father might have seen and recognized. Not the scale of it, not the money, but the intention underneath. The specific intention of looking at what other people had dismissed and finding what was actually there. Outside the shop, the November morning was cold and clear. The parking lot was ordinary. The street was ordinary. Somewhere across town, in a school building with fluorescent lights and a cafeteria that smelled like Friday pizza, Maya was in her 4th grade classroom doing math or reading or sitting in the deliberate stillness she used when she was thinking through something important. Cole put down his coffee. "All right," he said. "Let's get to work." The East Side building opened in March, 4 months after the agreements were signed, which was faster than anyone had predicted and slower than Cole had hoped. which meant it had gone approximately as these things actually go when you strip away optimism and account for reality. The foundation repair had taken 6 weeks and cost 40% more than the initial estimate, which Cole had mentally prepared for by doubling the estimate in his head before the work started. A habit from years of managing shop expenses, where the first number was always the hopeful number and the real number arrived later with less apology than it should have. The electrical had been worse than expected in the specific way that old commercial buildings always delivered their worst news. Not all at once, but in installments, each inspector visit producing a new finding that required a new conversation with a contractor who was already booked through February. The roof had been straightforward by comparison, which in the context of everything else felt like a gift. Cole had been on site for most of it, not supervising in any formal sense, he didn't have the expertise for that, but present, watching, asking questions, learning the building the way he'd learned cars his whole life, by paying attention to what it was telling him rather than what he expected it to say. There was something that appealed to him about that parallel, though he didn't mention it to anyone because it would have sounded like the kind of thing a person says when they're trying to sound thoughtful rather than when they actually are. Natalie had come twice during the build-out phase, both times without announcement. She'd texted an hour before, which Cole had decided counted as appropriate notice, given that she was the kind of person who operated on 15-minute scheduling windows, and an hour was probably generous by her standards. She'd walked through the space with the same quality of attention he'd watched her develop over the months since the Harrington. Not the 4-second assessment of the Meridian, but the longer, more honest look of someone who'd learned at considerable personal cost that first impressions were a starting point rather than a conclusion. The second visit, she'd brought a contractor of her own, a woman named Bev, 50s, who specialized in commercial workshop conversions and who had walked the space with Cole for 2 hours, making observations that were specific and useful and occasionally contradicted what Cole's contractor had done or planned to do, which produced a conversation between the two contractors that Cole had stayed mostly out of, and which had ultimately produced 3 changes to the build-out plan that saved a significant amount of money and 2 weeks of work. "You could have sent her in the beginning," Cole had said to Natalie afterward, while Bev was finishing her notes near the main bay. "You didn't ask," Natalie said. "I didn't know to ask." "No?" She looked at him. "But now you know she exists. That's the point of the partnership working over time. You don't have to know everything at the start. You have to be willing to not know things and keep asking." He thought about that for a while. It was good advice. It was also the kind of advice that was easier to give than to receive, which she seemed to understand about herself because she said it without the self-satisfaction that people sometimes brought to good advice. "You're getting better at this," he said. "At what?" "At saying things without making them sound like you already knew them." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm working on it," she said. Not defensive, just honest. The workshop opened on a Tuesday in March, which was not a particularly symbolic day, and which Cole had chosen specifically because he didn't want a grand opening, didn't want press or ceremony, didn't want the first day of the thing to be about how it looked rather than what it did. There was no ribbon, there was no party. There was Cole unlocking the main bay doors at 7:30 in the morning, and Diego and Carla and Sam arriving within the next 15 minutes, and Tommy pulling into the lot with a thermos of decent coffee and a paper bag of pastries from a bakery on the way, and that was the opening. The first vehicle came in that same afternoon. Not a remarkable vehicle, a 1971 sports car, British, that a private owner had purchased at an estate sale believing it to be a standard production model, and who had found, in the ownership papers in the glove box, some documentation that suggested it might be something slightly different. He'd contacted Cole through the website that Natalie's team had built, which Cole had reviewed and approved, and still wasn't entirely comfortable with because his face was on it in a photograph, and he'd never been comfortable with his face being on things. Cole spent 2 hours with the car that first afternoon, with Carla beside him doing documentation. She'd taken to documentation the way some people took to music, with a natural aptitude that improved visibly every time she practiced it. Diego handled the initial client intake, which he'd been practicing for the past 6 weeks, and which he did with a directness and care that Cole had come to recognize as Diego's specific quality. Not smooth, not polished, but real. The communication of someone who genuinely wanted to understand what the other person needed. Sam was under the car for most of it, calling out observations about the chassis geometry that Cole cross-referenced against his notes in his head and filed for later. Sam's eye had developed faster than Cole had expected, which meant Cole had either underestimated Sam or overestimated how long this particular education took, and he suspected it was some of both. The vehicle turned out to be exactly what the standard documentation said it was. A nice car, genuine, worth a respectable amount, but not more than that. Cole delivered this conclusion to the owner with the same care he'd have given a more extraordinary finding, because the conclusion was the conclusion regardless of what it was, and the owner deserved accuracy rather than disappointment shaped by how Cole wished it had gone. The owner shook his hand and thanked him and said he'd been braced for worse. He'd half expected Cole to tell him it was worth nothing at all. "It's a good car," Cole said. "That's enough." He meant it. That was the thing about the green car, the thing he'd been trying to understand his own relationship to ever since the Harrington. It had been extraordinary. But extraordinary was not the point. The extraordinary find at the Meridian had been possible only because of the 10,000 ordinary ones that had come before it. Every regular job, every unexceptional vehicle, every afternoon in a shop or a barn or a parking lot looking at something that turned out to be exactly what it appeared to be. The looking was never wasted. His father had said that, and his father had been right, and now Cole had 6,000 square feet of East Side building and 3 people learning to look because he'd looked often enough and long enough to know the difference. He thought about this more in the evenings, when Maya was doing homework at the kitchen table and the house was quiet, than he probably would have expected to. He wasn't naturally a reflective person. He was a doing person. His father had been a doing person. Their family had always processed things through activity rather than analysis. But the months since the Meridian had produced something in him that needed occasional examination, a kind of ongoing recalibration that he didn't have a name for, but that felt like a necessary part of whatever he was becoming. He was becoming something. That much was clear. The money had changed things in the obvious practical ways. The mortgage gone, the credit card gone, the constant low-level financial anxiety that had been his baseline for so long he'd stopped noticing it until it lifted. But it had also changed things in subtler ways that took longer to identify. He made decisions differently now, not more confidently, necessarily. He'd always had confidence in the areas where he had actual knowledge, but more patiently. The money had bought him time, and time was something he'd never had enough of, and with time came the possibility of thinking something through, rather than just acting on it, because acting was all the time he had. He called Gerald once a month. The calls had become a routine, not formal check-ins, just conversations, the ongoing dialogue of 2 people who'd been in the middle of something significant together and who'd developed an affection for each other's company in the process. Gerald was working on an essay about the green car for his journal, a proper academic treatment of the find and the authentication, with Cole's full cooperation and sign-off on the draft. Cole had read the draft in February, at the kitchen table, with Maya doing her own reading across from him. It was precise and thorough and contained nothing he'd call incorrect. It also felt, reading it, like a story about someone slightly different from himself. Someone who moved through the world with more intention and grace than Cole felt he actually possessed. He'd said this to Gerald on the phone. "That's what good documentation does," Gerald had said. "It finds the shape of a thing that's real but not always visible to the person inside it." "You make me sound like I knew what I was doing the whole time." "Didn't you?" "Not the whole time. Some of it I was just—" He paused. "Showing up and hoping." "Yes," Gerald said. "That's also in there, if you read carefully." Cole read it again more carefully. Gerald was right. It was in there. The second vehicle that came through the workshop that month was more interesting. A private collector had heard about the workshop through the network that Natalie's involvement had opened. Not a vehicle she'd referred directly, but a referral from someone who knew someone, the particular chain of connected knowledge that existed in the collector world, and that Cole was learning to navigate with the help of people who'd been in it longer than he had. The vehicle was a small racing car, possibly from the mid-1960s, with an uncertain history and provenance documents that were partial and potentially inaccurate, and which the owner had purchased knowing they were incomplete because the price had been right and the instinct had been present. Cole liked this owner immediately. He was a retired school teacher from Ohio named Harold Briggs, 63 years old, who'd been collecting vehicles with modest budgets and serious attention for 30 years, and who described himself, with a self-deprecating accuracy that Cole recognized, as someone who bought things he couldn't quite afford because he couldn't quite not. "I don't have your eye," Harold said on the first day, watching Cole work with Carla on the initial documentation. "I've never claimed to, but I've been wrong about enough things to know when something is interesting, even if I can't say exactly why." "That's a start," Cole said. "Is it a good start?" Cole looked at the car. "The interesting thing is usually right," he said. "It's the explanation that takes time." Harold stood back and watched them work with the patience of someone who'd been a teacher long enough to understand that the watching was not passive. The car took 3 weeks to document and research fully, with consultation from Gerald and an independent specialist in small series European racing cars from that period. The result was not as dramatic as the green card, and it was not a one-of-a-kind factory prototype with a vanished history. But it was what Harold had instinctively felt it was, something specific and genuine and more significant than its appearance suggested. A small series racing special, built by a constructor Cole had read about but never encountered physically, with a documented race history that had been partially lost when the constructor's records were dispersed after the company closed in 1971. The car was worth considerably more than Harold had paid for it. Not millions, but enough to matter to a retired schoolteacher who'd bought it because he couldn't quite not. When Cole told him the conclusion, Harold sat in the visitor chair in the workshop office, a chair Cole had bought specifically because clients needed somewhere to sit for these conversations, and was quiet for a long time. "I trusted something I couldn't fully explain," Harold said finally. "Yeah. And it was right. It was right." Harold looked at him. "How do you know? When to trust it?" Cole thought about the question seriously, because Harold had asked it seriously and deserved a real answer rather than a reassuring one. "You don't always," he said. "I've been wrong. More times than I've been right, probably, if you count the unremarkable vehicles I've looked at and moved on from. But you get better at knowing the difference between a real feeling and wishful thinking." He paused. "The real feeling is usually quieter. Wishful thinking makes noise." Harold considered this. "The interesting thing is usually right," he said, echoing Cole's earlier words back to him. "The interesting thing is usually right," Cole confirmed. Harold bought a membership in the workshop's consultation program that Natalie's team had designed, an arrangement where serious collectors could have vehicles assessed by the workshop on an ongoing basis, with priority scheduling and access to the network of specialists Cole had built since the Harrington. It was the third membership sold. The program was not yet profitable. It was, Cole had decided, the kind of thing that built slowly or not at all, and his job in the first year was to build it slowly. Natalie had said in one of their monthly calls they'd established a call schedule, first Tuesday of each month, 1 hour, sometimes less, that the membership program would either be the workshop's primary revenue stream within 3 years, or it would be the thing they shut down and replaced with something else, and that both outcomes were fine, as long as they were honest about which one was happening in real time rather than in retrospect. "Most businesses fail because they wait too long to acknowledge something isn't working," she said. "They have too much emotional investment in the original idea." "Are you telling me to be less emotionally invested?" "No." She was direct about it. "I'm telling you to stay emotionally invested in the outcome rather than the method. The outcome is the workshop, what it does, what it builds. The method is just the current best guess about how to get there." He thought about that for a week after the call. It was a useful way to think about things that he hadn't had language for before. He was also, over these months, in the ongoing process of figuring out what Natalie Ashcroft actually was to him, which was a question with no clean answer, and which he suspected didn't need one yet. They were partners, formally and contractually. They were, increasingly, something that resembled friends. Not comfortable friends, not the Tommy variety of friendship that ran on shared history and easy silence, but the specific kind of friendship that forms between people who've started from a position of misunderstanding and are building towards something more accurate. It was a friendship with friction in it. He said things she didn't agree with, and she said things he didn't agree with, and they both held their positions when their positions were right and updated when they weren't, and the updating was hard for both of them in different ways, and that was what made it real. She'd said something to him in February on one of the Tuesday calls that had stayed with him. They'd been talking about the mentorship program, specifically about Sam, who was progressing faster than anyone had anticipated and who had recently identified an anomaly in a vehicle's chassis geometry that Cole would have caught eventually, but that Sam had caught first. "He sees the way you see," Natalie had said. "Not yet. He's getting there." "How long did it take you?" Cole thought about it. 20 years, maybe more if I'm honest. "And he's doing it in what, 4 months?" "He's doing some of it in 4 months. The rest will take time. But the foundation is there." "Yeah," Cole said. "The foundation is there." Natalie had been quiet for a moment. "That's the thing you're giving that can't be bought," she said. "The capital, the space, the equipment, those can be bought. But the specific knowledge of how to look at something you've never seen before and understand what it actually is," she paused, "that passes from one person to another or it disappears. It doesn't transfer through documents." "My father gave it to me," Cole said. "I know," Natalie said. "And you're giving it to Sam, and Diego and Carla will give parts of it to whoever comes after them." She paused again. "That's the whole thing, isn't it? That's what the workshop is actually for." He hadn't said anything for a moment. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table late enough that Maya was in bed, the house quiet around him in the way it got after 10 o'clock when the day was fully over and there was no more performing of anything. "Yeah," he said. "That's what it's for." Sam turned 18 in April. Cole had not known his birthday was coming. Sam was not the kind of person who mentioned his birthday in advance, and found out about it from Diego, who had developed a reliable intelligence network regarding the shop's personnel through the simple method of paying attention to people. Cole bought him a set of inspection tools. Not expensive ones. Sam didn't need expensive ones yet, and Cole was specific about matching tools to stage of development, a principle his father had applied and which he'd carried forward. The right tool at the right time. A flashlight with a variable angle head. A set of calibrated gauges, a magnifying loupe of the kind that Gerald had used in the shop the day of the authentication. Sam unwrapped them at the workbench on a Friday afternoon with Diego and Carla watching, which made it slightly more ceremonial than Cole had intended. But these things happened. He picked up the loupe, turned it in his hands, looked at Cole. "This is what you used," he said, "on the green car." "Gerald used that type, yeah." "Do you have one?" "I have one." Sam turned the loupe over again. He was 18 years old, with grease on his forearms from the morning's work, and the particular expression of someone receiving something they'd earned rather than been given, which was a different expression and mattered. "Thank you," he said. Simple. Direct. No performance. "Don't thank me," Cole said. "Use it." Sam used it. That same afternoon, on the vehicle they were working, a compact Italian sports car from the early 70s whose ownership documentation contained a discrepancy that Cole had flagged on intake, Sam used the loupe on the firewall chassis plate and found a secondary stamping beneath the primary one that suggested a factory renumbering, which was a specific type of finding that meant a specific set of things in the world of vehicle provenance, none of them simple. Cole stood beside him and looked at what Sam had found and felt the particular satisfaction of watching someone use a tool correctly on the first real try. "What does that mean?" Sam asked. "It means we have more questions than we had this morning," Cole said. "Is that good?" "It means the car is interesting." He looked at Sam. "The interesting thing is usually right." Sam nodded slowly. He was already back at the chassis plate, the loupe in hand, looking. Maya turned 11 in May. Cole asked her what she wanted to do for her birthday, and she thought about it for 3 days with the seriousness she applied to decisions that mattered to her, and then said she wanted to see the workshop. He'd been surprised by this, or maybe not surprised exactly, but moved in a way he hadn't anticipated. She'd heard him talk about the workshop for months, and she'd asked questions about it with regularity, but she'd never asked to visit, which he'd interpreted as a boundary she was drawing for herself. The particular 11-year-old boundary between her father's world and her own. "You sure?" he said. We can do anything, dinner, movie, whatever you want. I want to see it, she said. I want to see what you built. He took her on a Saturday morning, early enough that Diego and Carla and Sam were there, but the space was quiet, the workday not yet fully started. She walked in through the main bay doors and stood in the center of the floor and looked up at the industrial ceiling with its high windows and around at the bays and the equipment and the current vehicles, and then at Diego and Carla and Sam, who were arranged somewhat self-consciously near the back because they'd known she was coming and had collectively decided that being present but not intrusive was the right call. She looked at all of it for a long time. "This is really yours," she said. Not a question. "It's really mine," Cole said. She nodded slowly. Then she walked over to the nearest vehicles. The Italian sports car with the chassis plate anomaly, which was still in documentation phase, and looked at it with her head tilted, studying the proportions, the panel joins, the way the body sat on the chassis. Cole watched her. She turned. "What's the story on this one?" He told her. She listened the way she always listened, thoroughly, without interrupting, asking one question when he finished that went to the center of what he'd said. Sam, who was near enough to hear the exchange, watched Maya with the expression of someone encountering a version of something familiar in an unexpected context. Later, when Maya was talking to Carla near the documentation station, they'd fallen into conversation naturally, Maya asking questions about Carla's binder that Carla was answering with undisguised pleasure at being asked. Sam came to stand beside Cole at the workbench. "She looks at things like you do," Sam said. Cole looked across the shop at his daughter, who was leaning over Carla's binder with the focused attention of someone who'd decided something was worth understanding. "Yeah," he said. "She does." "Did you teach her?" He thought about it honestly. "I don't know, maybe just by being around." Sam considered this. "That's how you got it from your dad," he said. "Right? Just by being around." Cole looked at him. Sam was 18 and lanky and had grease on his forearms at 9 in the morning and was occasionally capable of saying things that went directly to the center of something Cole had been working around for months. "Yeah," Cole said. "That's right." Sam nodded and went back to the chassis plate, loop in hand. Cole stood at the workbench and watched the shop around him, Carla and Maya at the documentation station, Diego on the phone in the office. Sam bent over the Italian car with the focused absorption of someone who was learning how to see, and felt the thing that he'd been trying to locate since the morning after the Harrington, when he'd lain in the hotel room with the bad coffee and the parking structure view and tried to understand what had changed. It wasn't the money. The money was real and important and had removed a specific kind of suffering from his life that he hadn't always admitted was suffering. But that wasn't the thing. It wasn't the car. The car was extraordinary, and he was glad he'd found it, and he didn't regret a single decision he'd made about it from the Meridian to the gavel. But the car was finished. The car had its new owners and its permanent place in the documented history of the vehicles that had been built and then lost and then found. And Cole's part in that story was complete. The thing was this room, this specific Saturday morning in March, with the light coming through the high windows and the people inside it doing the work. The real work, the ordinary, unremarkable work of looking carefully at things and trying to understand them honestly. The thing was that his father's knowledge was in this room, passed through Cole to Sam, and Sam was going to pass it somewhere Cole couldn't yet see, and that chain was unbroken. The thing was that Diego was not doing oil changes at a chain shop. The thing was that Carla's binder was getting better every week. The thing was that Maya was standing 20 feet away learning the difference between looking and glancing, the same lesson Cole had learned from a 32-year-old's hand on a chassis plate in his father's shop when he was younger than she was now. He thought about what Natalie had said. It passes from one person to another, or it disappears. It was not disappearing. The Harrington called in June with a request, not about a vehicle, about Cole. They wanted him to speak at their annual collectors' symposium in the fall, a half-day event that brought together historians, collectors, and industry professionals. A session on methodology, specifically on the process of identifying overlooked vehicles, the specific skills and approaches that his find at the Meridian had demonstrated. Cole's first instinct was no. He was a mechanic and a workshop operator. He was not a speaker. The idea of standing in front of a room of collectors and academics and telling them things they should already know had an absurdity to it that he was not sure he could perform around. He mentioned it to Natalie on the first Tuesday call. "You should do it," she said. "I'm not a speaker. You're a person with knowledge that other people in that room don't have, and who communicates it clearly to the people in your shop every day. That's what speaking is. It's different in front of strangers." "Not really." A pause. "What are you actually afraid of?" He thought about it. "That I'll say it wrong. That they'll hear what I do and decide it's not what they thought it was. That I'll be the mechanic from Claremont who got lucky and doesn't actually have anything to teach." Natalie was quiet for a moment. "You found a car that experts missed because you looked at it for 40 minutes, and they looked at it for 4 seconds. You built a workshop and a mentorship program in under a year. You turned 3 people who had no path into people who are building one." She paused. "That's not luck. And the people in that room know the difference." He said yes to the Harrington. He spent 6 weeks preparing the talk, which was harder than anything he'd done in recent memory, because explaining something you know intuitively is more difficult than doing it, and Cole had always been better at doing. He wrote it out first, longhand, at the kitchen table at night, because typing felt too fast for the kind of thinking he needed to do. Then he edited it with Tommy, who told him 2 sections were too long and 1 section was too short, advice that was delivered with the bluntness of someone who had no personal stake in any of it and was therefore reliable. Maya read the final version on a Thursday night, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, reading with the focused attention she brought to things she took seriously. When she finished, she looked up. "It's good," she said. "Is it honest?" "Yes," she said. "That's why it's good." She looked at him. "The part about Grandpa, don't cut that." "I wasn't going to." "Some people might tell you to cut it. Don't." "I won't." She slid the pages back across the table. "You're going to be nervous," she said. "Probably." "That's okay." She stood up, pushing her chair back. "Nervous means it matters. Tommy said that." "Tommy says things sometimes." "Tommy says useful things sometimes," she corrected, with the precision she applied to most things, and went to her room. The symposium was in October. Cole stood at the podium in a room of 200 people and felt, for about 30 seconds, the specific terror of being in the wrong room. Then he started talking. He started with the 40 minutes he'd spent with the green car in the back corner of the Meridian, and what he'd been looking at, and why it mattered, and what his father had taught him about the difference between looking and seeing, and the room, which had contained, he'd realized on entering, both Gerald and Patricia and Harold Briggs from Ohio, and at least 3 people he recognized from the Harrington auction floor, settled into the quality of attention he'd come to recognize as real, as opposed to polite. He talked for 42 minutes. He'd planned for 40. He didn't talk about the money. He didn't talk about the final bid number, or the net figure, or the mortgage payoff. Those were facts, but they weren't the point. And he'd learned enough about his own story by this point to know the difference between the facts and the point. He talked about looking. He talked about the specific patience that was required to see something no one else had seen, and how that patience was not natural for most people but was teachable, and how teaching it was the most important work he'd done in his adult life. He talked about Diego and Carla and Sam without using their names, because their stories were theirs to tell. He talked about what it meant to walk past something ordinary and decide for no fully articulable reason that it was worth 40 more minutes of your time. He talked about his father. He talked about the green car, not as a triumph, but as a test. The test of whether 32 years of ordinary looking could add up, in the right moment, to something extraordinary. And what it had shown him was that it could, but only because the ordinary looking had happened first, all of it. Every unremarkable afternoon in every unremarkable shop. The ordinary was not the prologue to the point. The ordinary was the point. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. The pause before the response, which in a room of 200 is its own kind of sound. And then it came. He didn't look at faces. He looked at the space above the heads of the audience the way Tommy had told him to when he'd coached him through the logistics of public speaking. And he stood at the podium while the applause went on and tried to breathe normally. Gerald was in the 3rd row, and he was standing. The questions afterward went 45 minutes past the scheduled end. The session moderator apologized twice for the overrun and then stopped apologizing because no one in the room appeared to want it to end. Harold Briggs asked the last question. He'd stood up near the back, the retired schoolteacher from Ohio, and waited his turn with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting. "You said the ordinary looking is the point," Harold said, "but most people don't know that when they start. Most people think they're waiting for the extraordinary thing. How do you teach someone to value the ordinary work before they've seen what it can lead to?" Cole looked at him across the room. "You show them," he said. "You put them in the space and you work beside them and you let them see that you take the ordinary vehicles as seriously as the extraordinary ones. They learn it the way I learned it, not from a lesson, from watching someone who already knows." Harold nodded. He seemed satisfied with this. "Thank you," he said, and sat down. Cole drove home that evening alone. He'd declined the symposium dinner, which was a choice he didn't second-guess, because he'd given what he had to give in that room, and he was empty in the specific way that meant he needed quiet rather than company. He drove the route from the city to Claremont in the October dark, the same route he'd driven with Tommy the night after the Harrington, and he let the dark and the road do what they did. He got home at 9:15. The front light was on. Maya had turned it on before she'd gone to bed. He stood in the driveway for a moment after he turned the engine off, looking at the house, his actual house, the one with the mortgage that was gone, and the ceiling fan down the hall, and the kitchen where he'd drunk bad coffee and run numbers and occasionally let himself believe that things were going to work out. They had worked out. Not cleanly, not without cost, not in the smooth, untroubled arc that stories sometimes pretended success looked like from the inside. They'd worked out with foundation problems, and contractor disagreements, and sleepless hotel rooms, and a 10-year-old's hand on his knee during an auction that had lasted too long and cost him everything he had. They'd worked out because he'd crouched in the back corner of a room where no one was looking and spent 40 minutes with something everyone else had dismissed, and because he'd trusted what 32 years of looking had built in him, and because his father had been the kind of man who passed things on rather than holding them, and because Maya was the kind of person who turned on the front light when she went to bed so her father would have light when he came home. He went inside. The house was quiet and warm. He put his jacket on the hook by the door and went to the kitchen and made tea because it was late enough that coffee was a bad idea, and sat at the table where he'd done all the thinking he'd needed to do over the past year. He thought about the green car. It lived now in the collection of the Texas Foundation, properly displayed, fully documented, in a climate-controlled space where people who knew what they were looking at could look at it properly. Cole had received photographs from the foundation director in September. The car in its new home, lit beautifully, the British racing green deep and alive under proper lighting. He'd looked at the photographs for a long time and felt something that was not quite nostalgia and not quite pride, and was probably just the feeling of a completed thing, a circle closed. He thought about what it actually was in the end. Not the car, the whole of it, the year, the finding and the proving and the building and the passing on. His father had spent 27 years in a shop he didn't own, teaching what he knew to the one person who happened to be nearby. That was the whole of what Frank Bennett had managed to do with his knowledge. Pass it to one person, imperfectly, with the gaps and failures and misunderstandings that all transmission between people involved. And Cole had spent the first part of his life not knowing how valuable that transmission was, and the middle part slowly understanding it, and now he was in the last room of that understanding, the one where you stop just receiving and start actually giving. The workshop was 8 months old. Diego had started talking about certification programs for the second year. Carla had been contacted by a vintage vehicle museum about a consulting arrangement, which she'd declined in order to stay at the workshop, which had made Cole feel something too large to name and which he had simply filed away. Sam had, in the past month, identified 3 anomalies in 3 separate vehicles that the workshop had taken on, each one requiring further investigation, each one the product of an eye that was getting sharper every week. These were not headlines. They were not auction room moments with 200 people standing. They were Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturday mornings, and the specific ordinary accumulation of work that built, over time, into something that mattered. The interesting thing is usually right. The looking is never wasted. He sat at the kitchen table with his tea and heard, from down the hall, the small sound of Maya's ceiling fan. She was 11 now, and she turned off her own light but left the front one on, and she could cook pasta from scratch and document a vehicle intake form and ask a question that went directly to the center of a thing. And she looked at the world with the particular patience of someone who'd learned, by proximity or inheritance or some combination of both, that what something appeared to be at first glance was only the beginning of what it actually was. Cole finished his tea. He washed the cup and put it on the rack and turned off the kitchen light. He walked down the hall past Maya's room. The ceiling fan, the quiet, the door slightly open the way she always left it. And went to his own room and got ready for bed and lay in the dark thinking about nothing in particular, which was new, which was what it felt like when the numbers stopped running by themselves in the middle of the night because the numbers were fine. Because everything that needed to be figured out had been figured out, or was in the process of being figured out by people he trusted to figure it out, which was itself a new thing, the trusting. He fell asleep before he expected to. Outside, the front light was still on. It would stay on until morning, the way it always did, burning steadily in the October dark, visible from the street, the ordinary signal of a house where someone had thought to leave a light for a person coming home. That was enough. That had always been enough.